Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The last vote. The polling station in the small American village was nothing out of the ordinary, a typical location for elections in a rural area. The station had been housed in the old, slightly worn-down building of the village school for decades, no longer serving its original purpose. The walls were peeling with cracked paint, and the air inside felt thick with silence, carrying the weight of countless past elections. The building stood on the outskirts of the village, far from the bustling streets and constant movement of the larger towns. The quiet was only interrupted by the occasional rustling of yellow leaves falling from the trees and carried by the soft breeze of late autumn. The sun was setting behind the horizon, casting an orange glow across the field outside, adding to the tranquil atmosphere. Inside the polling station, everything seemed as expected. Election booths were set up in neat rows, and a long table was arranged for the election committee members. There were no lines yet, no signs of anxiety. Everything was prepared for the voting process to begin in the morning. The election workers, including Alan, were busy double-checking the lists and making sure everything was in order. Alan had been a member of the election committee for years, a fixture in the village's election process. Today, he was in charge of organizing the flow of voters and ensuring that all the procedures went smoothly. He had seen this routine 100 times before. There was nothing unusual about this night, nothing that would suggest anything out of the ordinary was about to happen. The calm of the evening matched his feelings. Everything was going as planned. No one had expected anything to disrupt the peace of the small town. As he glanced around the room, his colleagues chatted quietly, preparing for the long day ahead. The whole night felt like the quiet before a storm that Alan had no way of knowing was coming. The evening continued its quiet course, but Alan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't obvious, and he couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but an unfamiliar unease began to settle deep in his chest. At first, he attributed it to the long hours of preparation and the looming weight of the election. But as the night wore on, the discomfort grew. The air around him felt heavier than usual, thick with a strange stillness. It wasn't the usual silence of a sleepy village night. There was something more to it. The faint creaks of the old school building seemed louder now, almost as if the walls themselves were whispering. Alan glanced around, but everything appeared normal. The other committee members were busy with their tasks, none of them showing any signs of distress. Yet, his pulse quickened, and his hands, though steady, felt damp. He turned to check the windows, half expecting to see something or someone outside in the dark. But the only thing visible was the vast stretch of empty field, the pale moonlight casting long shadows. No movement. No life. Just the distant rustling of the trees, sounding like a distant whisper. He exhaled deeply, trying to calm himself. "It's just nerves," he muttered under his breath, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at him. Every sound, every movement around him seemed more pronounced than usual. The soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt strangely oppressive. He could almost hear his own heartbeat in the silence, louder and louder, as though it were a drumbeat leading him to something he couldn't see. Alan tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the situation. But no matter how hard he tried, The gnawing sense that something was wrong, that he wasn't alone in the room, refused to leave him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he turned quickly, half expecting to find someone behind him. But there was no one. For a moment, the feeling intensified, a pressure on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. A sound, a faint scraping noise, came from somewhere in the hallway. Alan froze, straining to hear. It was almost like something dragging across the floor, but when he looked toward the hallway, there was nothing. Just the darkened corridor, empty and still. His breath hitched, and he forced a smile, trying to laugh it off. Just the wind, he told himself. But deep down, the unease was growing, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. As the minutes passed, Alan found it harder and harder to concentrate. The sensation of being watched, the inexplicable sounds, the oppressive atmosphere, it was as if the very air in the room had shifted. He tried to dismiss it all, but the feeling was becoming unbearable. "Everything's fine," he whispered to himself, though he wasn't so sure anymore. As the final voter cast their ballot, the small but steady stream of people coming and going gradually slowed to a halt. The room, which had been bustling with activity all day, now seemed empty, save for the committee members. The last of the election volunteers wiped their tired eyes, their faces pale from the long day. It had been a smooth election, nothing unexpected, at least, not on the surface. Alan moved mechanically, almost without thinking, as he started gathering the scattered papers and ballots. The weight of the day was beginning to settle in, the hours of counting, verifying, and double-checking. The flickering of the overhead lights, which had been steady all day, suddenly felt like a constant reminder of how late it had gotten. The other members of the election commission were similarly fatigued but focused. They went through the motions with practiced precision, closing up the booths and sealing the ballot boxes. Alan stood by, overseeing the process, making sure every detail was followed. The metallic sound of the ballot box being locked echoed in the room, a finality to the whole day. He couldn't help but feel the tension in the air as the last vote was placed inside the urn and sealed shut. "Everything in order?" one of the committee members, a woman named Mary, asked, her voice carrying a note of exhaustion. Alan nodded absently, glancing over the room. "Yes, all set." With the urn sealed, the final steps of the process began. The papers were filed, the forms double-checked, and the results were carefully reviewed. Everyone was eager to leave, to go home, to rest. It had been a long day. And yet, despite the routine of the process, there was an unmistakable heaviness in the air. It was a tension that couldn't be explained, a sensation that lingered in the pit of Alan's stomach. The night had grown colder, and the shadows outside stretched longer. The final envelope was sealed, confirming that everything had been counted, verified, and packed away. The room, once full of voices and footsteps, was now almost eerily silent. The hum of the lights was the only sound that remained, and it felt as though time itself had slowed. As Alan looked around at the tired faces of the committee members, he felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it through. The election had gone off without a hitch. All that was left now was to lock up and go home. But just as he reached for the keys to close the door, something caught his eye, a small slip of paper lying on the desk, unnoticed by anyone else. It was folded neatly, as if placed there deliberately. Alan froze for a moment, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't seen anyone enter the room in the past hour. With a sense of unease rising in his chest, he picked up the note and unfolded it. The message was simple but chilling. "You are not who you say you are." His breath caught in his throat. The words, so unassuming, suddenly felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He scanned the room again, looking for anyone who might have seen him find the note. But the room was empty. Everyone had already started packing their things. It was just him, alone with the strange message. A sense of dread settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Alan stood still for a moment, the note in his trembling hand. The words on the paper, simple yet unsettling, seemed to burn into his mind. "You are not who you say you are." He read the sentence over and over, trying to make sense of it, but no matter how many times he looked at the note, it offered no explanation. His heart raced, and a wave of unease washed over him. The room, which had felt perfectly normal just moments before, now seemed suffocating, as if the air had thickened with something darker, something he couldn't quite grasp. The note was so out of place. There was no reason for it to be there. No one had entered the room after the last voter, and no one had left a message. But somehow, the note had appeared on his desk, as if someone had deliberately placed it there, just for him. A part of him wondered if it was some kind of prank, a bad joke played on him by one of the other committee members. But it didn't feel like a joke. The words felt too deliberate, too cold. It was as if whoever had written it knew something about him, something he couldn't understand. The possibility that it might be a threat crossed his mind, but he immediately dismissed the idea. After all, who would want to threaten him? He was just a committee member in a sleepy village election. Trying to calm his racing thoughts, Alan placed the note back on the desk. He couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up his spine as he glanced around the empty room. The lights above flickered once, twice, and he quickly turned his attention back to the note, hoping it would somehow make sense if he stared at it long enough. But it didn't. He took a deep breath and tried to rationalize the situation. "It's probably just a mistake," he muttered to himself. "Maybe someone left it here by accident." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The words seemed too pointed, too personal. It was as though the message was meant for him specifically, and he had no idea why. 1,000 questions ran through his mind. Who could have left the note? Why would they leave a message like that, with no explanation? Could someone be watching him? Had he somehow become a target for something he didn't understand? He tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on the task at hand. He had to finish the final checks, pack up, and go home. Tomorrow was a big day. But the note lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. The weight of it seemed to follow him as he moved around the room, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were trying to escape the oppressive feeling of being watched. Alan glanced over at the committee members, who were still wrapping up their tasks. Mary, the woman who had asked him earlier if everything was in order, had already gathered her things and was heading toward the door. The others, too, seemed ready to leave, oblivious to the strange unease that had settled over him. But none of them had seen the note. None of them knew what he had just found. And that made him wonder, what if this was a warning? A warning about something that only he could understand, something only he had been chosen to see? Shaking his head, he forced himself to focus. "It's nothing," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. "It's just a coincidence." Yet, deep down, he couldn't rid himself of the nagging feeling that the message wasn't a coincidence at all. The uneasy feeling in Alan's chest had only deepened as the night wore on. He couldn't shake the image of the note from his mind. "You are not who you say you are." The words echoed in his thoughts, sending a shiver down his spine every time he tried to push them away. They felt like a riddle, a puzzle with no clear solution. Who would leave a message like that? And why him? The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. He couldn't help but notice the strange way the room had felt after he discovered the note, as if something unseen had changed, a weight pressing down on him, an invisible presence that wasn't there before. It wasn't just the words, it was the sense that something was wrong, something beyond his understanding. As he sat at his desk, staring at the note again, he couldn't help but remember something he had heard in passing some years ago about Election Day incidents. Alan had heard rumors of strange disappearances linked to polling stations, stories that no one ever really talked about. People vanishing without a trace after elections, especially in small towns like this one. At the time, it had seemed like just another baseless conspiracy theory, but now, with the note still fresh in his mind, he found himself wondering if there could be more truth to those stories than he had originally thought. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling as he searched online. His eyes skimmed over the articles about unsolved disappearances in other rural voting districts, election workers, volunteers, people who had worked on election night and were never seen again. The accounts were vague, but the patterns were disturbing. The more he read, the more his stomach turned. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were a series of eerie, unexplainable events stretching back for decades. People who worked elections in small towns, especially in areas where the voting process was more isolated, had gone missing without a trace, and no one ever connected the dots. His thoughts raced. Was this somehow related to his own situation? Could the note be part of something much bigger, something darker? He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples in frustration. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that he wasn't overreacting. Something was happening. But he didn't have any proof, no concrete evidence to back up his suspicions. It was all just whispers, half-remembered stories, and a nagging feeling that he couldn't escape. Trying to push the thoughts from his mind, Alan walked over to the other committee members, hoping to find some reassurance. But when he broached the subject, trying to casually ask if they had ever heard of anything strange happening on election nights, he was met with nothing but dismissive looks. "You're just tired," Mary said with a tired smile. "It's been a long day, Alan. Everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about." The others nodded in agreement, too busy with their own tasks to give his concerns much thought. Their lack of concern only deepened his feeling of isolation. If they didn't think anything was wrong, then maybe it was just him. Maybe he was overthinking things. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't shake the sense that he was missing something, that there was something he wasn't seeing. The more he tried to push it aside, the stronger the feeling became. Alan knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he figured out what was happening. But for now, the committee was wrapping up. He couldn't ask them to help, not when they were so intent on going home and pretending that everything was normal. He had to make his own decision. As the final minutes ticked by, and the last of the committee members gathered their things, Alan couldn't help but wonder if he was the only one who could see the danger lurking beneath the surface. He glanced back at the desk where the note had been left, his heart still pounding. He had to leave, he knew. But as he walked toward the door, the unease didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. He wasn't sure what to do next. But one thing was certain, Alan wasn't going to forget this night. And whatever had begun tonight, whatever force was behind it, wasn't going to let him go so easily. The following days were a blur for Alan. The events of the election night weighed heavily on his mind, but it wasn't just the note anymore. It was the creeping sense that something had shifted, something that couldn't be easily explained. He tried to go about his usual routine, but the questions gnawed at him relentlessly, refusing to let go. Every time he closed his eyes, the words of the note, "You are not who you say you are," resurfaced, lingering in his thoughts like a shadow. Who would leave such a message? What could it possibly mean? He couldn't help but feel that it was no accident that someone or something was trying to send him a warning. But a warning about what? The more he tried to convince himself it was just a prank, the more the feeling of dread grew. The unease never left, following him through each waking moment like a constant companion. Alan couldn't stop thinking about the strange disappearances he had found during his research, the ones he had brushed off as mere rumors in the past. He had come across stories online about election workers in small towns across the United States who had mysteriously vanished after the polls closed. No one ever seemed to know what had happened to them. They would simply disappear without a trace, leaving behind empty homes, unanswered phones, and unsettled families. These weren't just stories from distant places, they had occurred in areas not too far from his own town. As he sat at his desk late one evening, scrolling through article after article, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The patterns were unsettling. People who had worked on election days for years, some of them deeply involved in local politics, had simply vanished without explanation. Alan found names, faces, and dates, but there was no closure, no resolution. The cases were marked as unsolved, left to fade into the background, swept under the rug like so many other unsettling truths. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. The disappearances seemed to occur on a regular basis, tied to elections, especially in small rural districts like his own. But what made them so eerie wasn't just the fact that they happened, it was the sheer normality of the events leading up to them. In every instance, everything had appeared perfectly fine until the final ballots were counted, and then the workers, volunteers, or committee members simply vanished. There was no trace. No one had seen them leave, and no one ever heard from them again. He closed his laptop, rubbing his face in frustration. This couldn't just be a coincidence. These were not random disappearances. There had to be something more to it, something that connected these events in a way he couldn't quite put together. As the last election day drew closer, Alan felt the tension in his chest tightening. He had been a part of that system. He had worked on the very same elections these people had, and now it seemed as though he was beginning to understand something they never had. Something dark and powerful was lurking beneath the surface, and it had already begun to reach out for him. The air in his small apartment felt thick with the weight of his thoughts. Alan tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but it only seemed to grow stronger. He started to question every noise in the night, every shadow that moved too quickly across the floor. He wasn't sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, or if the tension of the research had finally taken its toll. Could he be the next one to disappear? Was he already too deep into something he couldn't escape? The thought was suffocating. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew that this was just the beginning. It had been hours since Alan had attempted to fall asleep, but the oppressive weight of the night had refused to release him. His mind raced with thoughts of the mysterious disappearances, the note, the strange feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind conjured images of the election workers who had vanished without a trace, their lives seemingly erased from existence. He couldn't shake the suspicion that he was being drawn into something much larger than himself, something that had been lurking for far longer than he had realized. He tossed and turned in his bed, his thoughts tangled and restless, until a low creak from outside his window broke through the tension in his mind. For a moment, Alan thought it was just the wind, but then came another sound, followed by a scraping noise that seemed to come from inside the building. His heart skipped a beat. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but there it was again, a noise that shouldn't have been there. The old election building was supposed to be empty now, the doors locked, and the lights turned off. But this was different. With a sense of growing anxiety, Alan sat up in bed and pulled on his clothes. His pulse quickened as he grabbed his keys and stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting his skin like a shock. The streets were empty, the quiet of the small town only broken by the sound of his hurried footsteps. As he approached the familiar building, the quiet stillness made him uneasy. Everything seemed undisturbed from the outside, but something in his gut told him that wasn't the case. He tried to dismiss it, but his instincts urged him to go inside to find out what was happening. Maybe it was nothing, maybe he was just imagining things. But he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something had changed, something important was happening right under his nose. The key turned in the lock, and he stepped into the darkness of the election office. The air felt colder than it had before, and a strange smell lingered, something faintly metallic and damp. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Alan noticed that the building looked different, as though it had been disturbed. Some of the chairs were pushed back, a few files were out of place, and there were small marks on the floor, almost like someone had dragged something across it. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the scene felt wrong, like someone had been here recently, but who? And why would they have come back after everything had been locked up for the night? Alan slowly walked deeper into the room, every creak of the floorboards making him tense. He reached the desk where the voting materials had been stored, and there it was, a faint, smudged print on the corner of the desk that hadn't been there earlier. The faintest trace of something heavy having been moved. He bent down to get a better look, but all of a sudden, a sound, sharp and sudden, made him jump back. It was the unmistakable noise of footsteps, but they weren't his. Someone else was here. Alan froze, every muscle in his body tensing as he strained his ears to listen. There were no voices, no sign of anyone nearby, just the eerie sound of those footsteps. They seemed to be coming from the back hallway, further inside the building. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him he wasn't alone. He turned quickly, trying to find a way to leave without being noticed, but the room seemed to close in on him. The walls felt narrower, as if the very building itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. And in that silence, Alan knew he had to make a choice, to confront whatever was hidden here, or to leave before it was too late. The morning after his unsettling visit to the election building, Alan found it impossible to shake the unease that had settled deep within him. He hadn't been able to explain the strange sounds or the disturbance he had found in the office, and the memory of those footsteps echoed in his mind, making it hard to focus. But there was no turning back now. Something was amiss, and he couldn't let it go. The disappearances weren't just isolated incidents, there was a pattern, something bigger that he couldn't ignore any longer. As the days passed, Alan immersed himself in the investigation. He began by pulling up old election records from past years. Newspaper clippings, archived stories, and official documents. The more he dug, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. On the surface, it all seemed mundane, just routine election procedures, but between the lines, in the small, overlooked details, something wasn't right. Alan spent hours in the local library, sifting through dusty archives and yellow newspapers, looking for anything that might explain the strange disappearances. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon a series of articles detailing missing persons who had been involved in the election process over the past several decades. These weren't just the occasional disappearances one might expect in a small town. They were systematic and precise, often occurring right after the ballots were counted. One article caught his attention in particular. It was an old report from the 1980s about a missing election volunteer who had vanished after the results were tallied in a nearby town. The local authorities had dismissed the incident, claiming that the volunteer had simply left town or gone into hiding. But the article had been written by a journalist who seemed convinced that something more sinister had taken place. He mentioned rumors of strange rituals associated with the voting process, things that hadn't been reported in the official records. Alan leaned in closer, reading the article with a growing sense of dread. The journalist had uncovered that, in some small rural towns, certain elections were marked by inexplicable events, a shadowy force that seemed to move behind the scenes, orchestrating the disappearances. According to the reporter, the volunteers who disappeared were often the ones who had a close relationship with the voting process, those who knew the ins and outs of the election systems. But there was more. The report mentioned that after the disappearances, people would start to notice subtle changes in the towns. The very nature of the elections, the very act of voting, had been altered, manipulated by something much darker. At first, Alan dismissed the idea as superstition, but the more he read, the more it seemed plausible. He kept encountering references to an old, forgotten ritual that had once been practiced in these towns. The ritual wasn't about who won or lost the election, it was about control, power over the very will of the people. And what better way to manipulate a community than through the act of voting? His heart raced as he recalled the strange sensation he felt during his time at the election office. The unease, the feeling of being watched, it suddenly made sense. The ritual was real, and it had been happening for years, hidden in plain sight under the guise of normal elections. There were no clear answers, no smoking gun. But Alan was certain that the disappearances weren't a coincidence. The missing election workers weren't just victims of a random act of violence or negligence. They had been caught in something far more insidious, a power struggle hidden within the process of the vote itself. He thought back to the note he had found, the one that had haunted him since that night. "You are not who you say you are." Was it a warning? Or was it a sign that he had already become part of something far darker than he could comprehend? As Alan dug deeper into the mystery, he realized that each new piece of information only raised more questions. Who or what was behind the disappearances? Why did the elections, of all things, hold such power? And what role was he, a simple election committee member, destined to play in all of this? It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary investigation. He wasn't just looking for missing people, he was uncovering a centuries-old conspiracy, and the more he uncovered, the closer he came to discovering a terrifying truth. As Alan continued to sift through the old records, the weight of his discoveries began to sink in. It wasn't just the disappearance of one or two election workers, there were patterns, recurring events that formed a chilling mosaic of missing persons. The more he read, the clearer it became that these weren't isolated incidents. They were connected by something far more sinister. In his search, Alan found a series of articles, local police reports, and eyewitness accounts describing people who had vanished after their involvement in election day operations. The cases stretched back over decades, many of them dating back to the early 1900s. The names of the missing were eerily similar: volunteers, committee members, anyone deeply entrenched in the voting process. But as Alan read further, he began to notice something strange. The disappearances always seemed to occur on the night of or shortly after an election. In each case, the missing individuals had left their posts, disappeared without a trace. Some had been last seen leaving the polling place late in the night after the ballots had been counted and the voting booths closed. Others had just vanished, with no trace of a struggle or sign of foul play. It was as though they had simply disappeared into thin air, leaving only the echo of their absence. Alan couldn't help but feel a deep unease growing within him as he compared the dates and places of the disappearances. The missing people all seemed to have one thing in common. They were the ones who had managed the final steps of the election process, counting the votes, securing the ballots, sealing the urns. The very last stage, the moment when the process was supposedly completed. And after that, they were never seen again. There was something about the timing that felt deliberate, as though the disappearances were triggered by a certain event, the completion of the election. But why? Why were these specific individuals targeted? What was the connection between them, and what was the purpose behind their vanishing? The more Alan investigated, the more the dots began to connect. Each case seemed to point to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface of these routine elections. The first signs of the pattern became clear. The victims had all been present during the final tally, the closing of the election. Was it simply a coincidence that they were gone once the ballots had been sealed? Or was there something more to it? His heart raced as he felt the weight of the mystery pressing on him. Alan could sense that he was getting closer to the truth, but with each step forward, the fear deepened. He was no longer just looking for answers. He was uncovering a dark undercurrent that ran through the very foundation of the election process. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized that the truth was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. Alan was entangled in something far beyond what he had initially thought. The closer he got to uncovering the truth, the more he realized that he was walking a dangerous path, a path that led not just to missing people, but to something that threatened his own life. As he sat in the dim light of his apartment, Alan could feel the walls closing in. The investigation was taking him to places he never thought he would go. Each new piece of evidence sent a chill through his body. He wasn't just researching an election gone wrong. He was uncovering the terrifying consequences of a ritual that had been playing out for generations, and he was beginning to realize that he was now part of that same ritual. The missing people weren't just victims of chance. They were part of a much larger, much darker plan, and Alan could feel himself getting closer to becoming the next victim, unless he could somehow stop what was happening before it was too late. Alan could no longer shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The weight of his discoveries about the missing election workers haunted him, but he felt increasingly isolated. His colleagues, those he had worked alongside for years, seemed oblivious to his growing unease. Whenever he tried to broach the subject of the disappearances or the strange occurrences on election night, their responses were dismissive, bordering on patronizing. "You're overthinking this, Alan. It's just coincidence, nothing more," one of them, Linda, said as she shuffled through the final paperwork of the day. Her tone was light, but there was a coldness in her eyes, as if she was shutting him out on purpose. But Alan couldn't let it go. He pressed them, tried to talk to them more seriously about the incidents from past elections, but they all seemed uninterested or even uncomfortable with the subject. Linda, John, and even the usually chatty Mark gave him nothing but empty reassurances and nervous glances. There was something strange in the way they acted, something that made him feel like they were hiding something from him. His thoughts were racing, and with each passing minute, the discomfort grew. Was he the only one who could see that something was wrong? He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, and now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could trust those around him. Could his colleagues be involved in these disappearances? Were they covering something up? The feeling of distrust gnawed at him. Even David, who had been working at the polling station for years, seemed unusually distant. Alan tried to make eye contact with him once, hoping for a shared understanding, but David quickly looked away and muttered something about needing to check on the remaining ballots. It was subtle, but Alan couldn't ignore the way his hand trembled slightly when he touched the papers. Doubt crept in like a shadow. What if they knew more than they were letting on? What if they were part of whatever was going on? The thought made his stomach turn. Unable to shake his growing paranoia, Alan decided he needed to leave to get some distance from the voting station and the suffocating atmosphere of the place. He needed to clear his mind, to breathe in fresh air, to find some semblance of normality before he completely lost his grip on reality. He gathered his things, threw on his jacket, and headed out the door. The night air felt unusually cold as he stepped onto the quiet streets, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he walked away from the building, the distant hum of the small town seemed to fade, swallowed by the oppressive weight of his thoughts. His mind was racing. There were too many unanswered questions. Who was behind these disappearances? What was the true nature of this election process? Why was everyone acting so strange? But then, just as he was about to step onto the main road that led out of the village, he heard something, a faint murmur that seemed to come from nowhere, echoing around him. It was a voice, low and indistinct, barely audible, but it froze him in place. Alan. His name was whispered again, this time louder, unmistakable, and unmistakably close. The voice seemed to come from all directions, from the very air around him, sending a chill down his spine. He stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat broke out on his forehead, and for a moment he couldn't tell if he was dreaming or awake. Was he hearing things? Was this just his fear getting the best of him? Alan. The voice came again, more insistent this time. It sounded like someone familiar, someone he knew, but he couldn't place it. Slowly, he turned around, expecting to see one of his colleagues, perhaps David, standing behind him. But there was nothing. The street was empty, bathed in the cold, indifferent light of a lone street lamp. Panic began to swell within him. His first instinct was to run, to get away from the voice, from whatever it was that was haunting him. But his feet wouldn't move. It was as though something was holding him in place, forcing him to listen, to understand. "What do you want?" he called into the empty street, his voice trembling with fear. There was no response, only the chilling silence of the night. Then, suddenly, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. It wasn't just one voice anymore, but many, all layered together, speaking in an unintelligible murmur. They surrounded him, closing in, making his head spin. He tried to take a step forward, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if something invisible was holding him back. His mind screamed at him to run, to get away, but his body refused to obey. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were clear now, echoing in his ears as though they were right next to him. Alan's breath caught in his throat. The voice sounded so real, so close, that he could almost feel the presence of whoever was speaking. But there was no one there. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening. He had to get out of there. Whatever this was, whatever was happening, he couldn't stay. But as he turned to flee, the world around him seemed to blur, the sounds growing more distorted, more oppressive, as though the very air was closing in on him. And just as he was about to take another step, something grabbed him from behind, pulling him back into the shadows. Alan screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the growing cacophony of voices, and then everything went dark. The morning after the terrifying encounter in the street, Alan couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. His thoughts were still tangled in the whispers that had followed him, the voice that had called his name. He had tried to convince himself it was just stress, that the weight of the day had cracked his mental stability. But deep down, He knew there was more at play. Unable to sleep, Alan spent the entire night scrolling through old records, hoping to find some clue that could explain what was happening to him and the others in this small, seemingly normal village. He had already seen references to the disappearances in the election records, but there was something deeper, a shadow, a dark undercurrent that had haunted this town for centuries. In the dim light of his living room, the glow of his laptop cast long shadows on the walls as he sifted through digitized archives of the village's history. He uncovered old town records and news articles that went back decades, some from the early 1900s, detailing strange rituals and eerie practices tied to the election process. One document in particular caught his eye, a handwritten note from the 1920s, mentioning an ancient ritual held during every election cycle, a ritual that was said to control the very will of the voters. It spoke of a binding ceremony performed under the cover of darkness, where the villagers participated in a ritual that wasn't just about casting ballots, it was about offering their will to something unseen, something powerful. At first, Alan was skeptical. It all sounded like folklore, the type of superstition that small towns sometimes created to explain unexplained events. But the more he read, the more he began to realize that this wasn't just random myth. This ritual, whatever it was, seemed to play a central role in every election held in this village, possibly dating back hundreds of years. Alan found more references, strange disappearances, the sudden deaths of those who worked on the election committees, and unsettling stories about people who changed after serving as election workers. The records mention a cycle of people being chosen for a higher purpose, a purpose they never seemed to recall once they had served. They were told to leave, and they did, without a trace. Some even described a blankness in their eyes after their term was over. A particularly chilling article from the 1950s described a series of unexplained incidents after a controversial election. A number of committee members had vanished, only to return years later, their personalities altered, as if they were no longer the same people. The villagers talked about a curse or a presence that haunted the election night. The older townsfolk spoke in hushed tones, warning anyone new to avoid being chosen for the committee. But Alan wasn't just reading about vague ghost stories. He started connecting dots. This wasn't a one-off thing, this was part of the village's history. The strange rituals, the disappearances, the eerie change in people after elections, it all seemed to point towards something much more sinister than coincidence. One account mentioned a secretive group of villagers who were believed to be the keepers of the election process. These individuals, rarely seen, were said to have knowledge of the ancient rites, and they were always present at the polls, watching over the voting process with unsettling vigilance. The last known mention of these keepers was just a few years before Alan's own time, but they had long since faded into obscurity. Alan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread as he pieced together the information. This was not just about elections. It was something much larger. The voting process was simply a means to an end, a method of controlling the village through manipulation and dark forces. The town's participation in the elections was not about civic duty, it was about a pact with something ancient, something that fed off the power of human will and decision-making. As he stared at the stack of papers and his computer screen, the full weight of his discovery hit him. The rituals, the missing people, the eerie sense of fear that always surrounded the election night, he had uncovered something dark, something dangerous. It was no longer a question of whether or not these events were connected. They clearly were. But as much as Alan wanted to believe he could stop what was happening, a terrible realization gripped him. He had been part of the process. He had served on the committee for years, just like the others. How much had he unknowingly contributed to this dark cycle? Was he already marked, chosen, a pawn in something much larger than he could comprehend? The thought paralyzed him. He was trapped in a system that had existed long before he arrived, and if he didn't act soon, he might end up like those before him, lost, changed, and forgotten. But there was no going back now. Alan knew he had to dig deeper, no matter how dangerous it became. This village had secrets that could destroy him and everyone else in the process. After hours of reading through the chilling history of the village, Alan knew he had to do more than just sift through old documents. He had to confront the people who had lived here their entire lives, the ones who might know things that weren't written down. His mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear: he needed to speak to the elders. The older generation held the key to understanding the dark history of the elections and the rituals that seemed to govern them. So, Alan set out the next morning to visit the homes of several of the village's oldest residents. Their stories, he hoped, would give him the clarity he so desperately needed. He started with Miriam, a woman in her late 80s who had lived in the village all her life. Her house was tucked away at the edge of the village, an ancient structure with cracked windows and an overgrown garden. As he approached, a strange unease settled in his chest. Miriam was known to be a quiet woman, with a sharp mind despite her age, but there was something about her that made people keep their distance. When he knocked on her door, she greeted him with a knowing look, as though she had been expecting him. "I know what you're after, Alan," she said softly as she invited him in. "But be careful. Some things are better left buried." Alan sat down with her, his notebook and recorder in hand, as he gently probed her for information about the village's past. At first, Miriam was hesitant, but as he persisted, her stern demeanor began to soften. "It all started decades ago," she began, her voice low, "back in the early days of the 20th century. The elections weren't just about votes, not back then. The people who ran them, they weren't just counting ballots. They were performing rituals. And the votes weren't just a choice. They were a sacrifice." Alan listened intently as Miriam spoke of a time when the village was under the control of a secretive group of influential families who had long known the power of ritual. According to Miriam, every election was held with a specific purpose: to appease whatever force ruled over the land. The ritual was designed to ensure the will of the village was in line with this dark power. The elections weren't about democracy, they were about fulfilling the ancient pact. Miriam explained that the ritual was subtle at first. It was said that the people chosen to work as election officials were marked, selected by the keepers who ensured the process ran smoothly. At first, there were no signs of anything unusual. But as the years passed, things started to change. People began to disappear, Miriam continued, her eyes narrowing. First, just one or two. They would vanish right after the election, never to be seen again. But their souls? Their souls would linger, trapped in the voting booths, the ballot boxes. That's how it all started. Alan felt a chill creep down his spine. This was exactly what he had been reading about: the disappearances, the unsettling stories of election workers who returned as different people. But there was more. Miriam spoke of how these disappearances were not random, they were the result of the ritual growing in power, each election feeding the entity that controlled the village's fate. As time went on, the force behind the ritual became stronger, Miriam added, her voice barely a whisper. The elections weren't just for choosing leaders anymore. They were to feed something that needed more than just blood. It needed the very will of the people, their desires, their choices. The more they voted, the more it grew. Alan was stunned. The thought that the very process of voting, something so seemingly normal, had been twisted into a dark ritual to feed some ancient power was beyond comprehension. Yet, he could feel it now. the weight of the past pressing in on him. Something had been awakened in the village, and it was growing stronger with each passing election. Miriam's voice trembled as she finished her tale, the years of fear evident in her eyes. "We used to have a choice," she said. "But now it's too late. The village is already bound, and no one can escape its pull." After leaving Miriam's house, Alan visited several other elderly residents. The stories were all eerily similar. Each one spoke of the elections starting as a civic duty, but gradually turning into something far darker. The villagers spoke of the strange men who watched over the voting process, always lurking in the background, always there when someone was chosen for the election committee. In every account, Alan saw the same pattern. The elections had become more than just a means of selecting leadership. They had become a method of control, a way for the village to be governed by something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. The more Alan learned, the more he realized that the power behind these rituals was far older than any election. It had been feeding on the will of the people for generations. And now, it was growing more powerful than ever. As Alan walked back to his car, the full weight of the village's secret bore down on him. The strange, unsettling occurrences weren't just coincidences, they were part of something larger, something ancient. The rituals weren't just about controlling the villagers, they were about feeding a power that had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right time to fully emerge. The elections were no longer about choice or democracy. They were about survival, survival of the village, survival of the ancient force that controlled it, and survival of those who dared to challenge it. And Alan knew, deep in his gut, that he was now a part of that dark history. There was no turning back. Alan's mind had been spinning since his conversation with Miriam, and the more he learned, the more he felt like he was descending into an abyss he couldn't escape. The election, the ritual, and the mysterious disappearances all began to converge into something darker than he could have ever imagined. He could no longer deny the truth. Something malevolent was at work here, and he was now a part of it, whether he liked it or not. Late one night, unable to sleep, Alan decided to return to the voting station alone. He had to see it for himself, the place where everything seemed to happen. The air outside was thick with fog, the cold biting at his skin as he approached the building. His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Something was waiting for him, and he could feel its presence. The doors to the voting station creaked open, and Alan stepped inside, greeted by an oppressive silence. The once bustling room was now empty, its walls lined with shadows. As he walked past the voting booths, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was watching him. It was as if the very walls themselves were alive, waiting for him to make a mistake. He paused near one of the ballot boxes, his hand shaking slightly as he touched the cold surface. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of movement, something dark darting in the corner of his eye. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, stretching longer with each passing second. Suddenly, a whisper echoed through the room. It wasn't a voice he could recognize, more like a distant murmur, carried by the wind. His breath caught in his throat as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was as if it was calling to him, urging him to listen, to understand. "You can't escape," the voice whispered. "You are already part of us." Alan froze, his blood running cold. The voice sounded ancient, like it had been echoing through the walls of this very building for centuries. The darkness seemed to draw closer, surrounding him from all sides. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as though they were rooted to the floor. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. In the total darkness, Alan's heart raced. He heard soft shuffling footsteps, the sound growing louder as if something, or someone, was moving toward him. A chill ran down his spine, and he instinctively backed away, his breath shallow and quick. The air was thick, heavy with an energy that felt wrong, as if it was charged with an unseen force. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it any longer, a sudden flash of light filled the room. But it wasn't the lights of the building flickering back on. No, this was something far more intense, an otherworldly glow, pulsing in the center of the room. Alan turned his head toward it, and in that moment, he saw it. The shape. The dark, shifting form that seemed to loom just beyond the edges of the light. It was like nothing he had ever seen, part shadow, part substance. A mass of swirling darkness that seemed to move with a mind of its own. And then he heard it again, the voice. Louder now, more insistent, as if the very air was vibrating with it. You are not alone here, Alan. You never were. The people of this village, they are ours. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The disappearances, the strange occurrences, the voices in the night, Alan understood now. The people who worked the elections, the voters themselves, they weren't just being controlled. They were being consumed. Every time someone cast a vote, they were feeding this entity. Their wills, their choices, their very essence were being drawn into the dark force that had existed here for centuries. And now, Alan was a part of it. Alan stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest, but his body refused to obey. The force was too powerful, and it felt like it was pulling him in, drawing him closer to its dark center. His thoughts raced as he tried to fight against it, but the voice was in his head now, whispering secrets that he didn't want to hear. You will never leave. You will never escape. The village has already claimed you, just as it claimed them. The figure in the center of the room grew larger, more distinct. He could see eyes. No, they weren't eyes at all, but empty sockets that seemed to watch him, judging him. The darkness closed in around him, and for the first time in his life, Alan truly felt fear. It was not just a fear of the unknown, it was a fear of being utterly consumed by something older and more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. As Alan's knees buckled beneath him, the room seemed to tilt, and he thought he might fall into the abyss. But then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the darkness receded, and he was left gasping for breath on the cold floor. The voice was gone, the shape vanished, and Alan was alone once more. But the room felt different. He could still feel the weight of its presence, lingering in the air. Alan struggled to his feet, trembling, his body aching as though something had drained him. But he wasn't the same. He could feel it, something inside him had shifted. Something had been awakened. He stumbled toward the door, his mind racing with the knowledge of what he had seen. He had been right to suspect the elections were more than just a civic duty. But now, he understood that they were the lifeblood of the village and the dark force that controlled it. The power that had been feeding on the villagers for generations was not finished with him yet. In fact, it had only just begun. And as Alan made his way back into the night, he knew there was no escaping what was coming. The village had claimed him, and he could already feel the grip of its will tightening around him. Alan stumbled out of the voting station, his breath ragged and his body trembling. The darkness that had surrounded him inside seemed to have followed him, lingering in the air, pressing on him from all sides. His mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he imagined it? Was the voice real? Was the shadow real? Or was this just his mind breaking under the pressure? He looked back at the voting station, now standing silent in the fog. The once familiar building now seemed alien to him, as if it were no longer just a place of civic duty but a place of power, an ancient, dark power that had chosen him as its next victim. His legs were heavy, but he pushed forward, determined to leave the village and find a way to escape whatever force had ensnared him. The streets of the village were empty, eerily quiet. The usual sounds of late-night activity, the rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of conversation, all were absent. It was as if the entire village had gone silent, waiting. Alan's mind raced as he quickened his pace, wanting nothing more than to get far away, to escape the suffocating grip of the malevolent force that seemed to follow him. He turned onto the narrow road that led out of the village, the fog wrapping around him like a shroud. But no matter how fast he walked, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the sense that something was following him, something unseen, something that knew his every move. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence, not his own. He spun around, but the street was empty. Nothing but fog and shadows. Alan stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't alone. "You can't run, Alan," the voice whispered again, this time from directly behind him. The sound was soft, like a breath on his neck, but it was unmistakable. Alan froze, his body locking in terror. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the quiet pulse of his own heartbeat. But that voice, it was here. With him. Watching him. Waiting. The chill in the air intensified, and the shadows around him seemed to deepen, stretching out toward him, creeping along the edges of his vision. Alan's heart raced as he spun around, desperate to escape. He could see the fog thickening, swirling around him like a living thing, blurring his vision and closing in on him. He broke into a run, not caring where he was going. His mind was consumed by one thought: get away. But no matter how fast he ran, it felt like he was moving in place, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him back. The village stretched out endlessly before him, the path looping around, no longer leading anywhere. He had left the voting station, yet it was as though he hadn't gone anywhere at all. It felt like he was trapped in a maze that kept shifting, changing shape with every step he took. The voice came again, this time closer, more forceful. "You cannot escape your fate." Alan tried to scream, to yell out for help, but his voice caught in his throat, strangled by the oppressive air around him. He fell to his knees, the weight of the fog and the voice pushing him down, his breath ragged and shallow. He realized with a sickening certainty that this force, whatever it was not limited to the boundaries of the voting station. It wasn't confined to any single place. It was everywhere. Alan was in its grip, and it was following him, hunting him. The more he tried to escape, the deeper he sank into its hold. Desperate, he pulled himself to his feet, staggering forward through the thickening fog. The village seemed to shift around him, its familiar landmarks now unrecognizable, as though they were being altered by some unseen hand. He was no longer sure if he was even on the same road. Then, in the distance, he saw something. A figure standing motionless in the fog, its outline hazy, but unmistakably human. Alan's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know if he should run toward it or away from it. But the figure was not moving, standing still as if waiting for him. It felt like a trap. He hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still no response. "Don't bother," the voice echoed again, coming from every direction at once. "She's not real." Alan stopped, his pulse pounding in his ears. What was real? What was this nightmare he was living through? The figure blurred and distorted, flickering like an old television screen before it vanished completely. The fog thickened even more, wrapping around Alan like a prison. Every direction he looked seemed to lead to more fog, more shadows, more whispers. The walls of his world were closing in, and he realized, horribly, that there was no way out. He had left the voting station, but the station was everywhere now. The village, the fog, the darkness, it was all part of the same entity, the same consuming force. There was no escape. Alan collapsed, his body shaking with exhaustion and terror. He was trapped in this village, in this nightmare, with no way to fight back. He could feel it, feel the weight of it pressing down on him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He was part of it now. Alan couldn't move. His limbs felt as though they were weighed down by invisible chains, and his mind was numb with fear. The fog was no longer just a physical presence, it had become a suffocating force within him, curling around his thoughts and drowning out any hope of escape. Every breath he took felt thick, as if he were inhaling the very darkness that surrounded him. His heart pounded violently in his chest, the only sound in the oppressive silence that had overtaken the village. But even his heartbeat seemed to be fading, as though it were being slowly absorbed by the chilling presence that hovered over him. "You can't escape, Alan," the voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was an overwhelming, omnipresent roar, coming from all directions at once. The voice seemed to penetrate every part of him, his soul, his mind, his very being. There was no place left to hide. Alan's thoughts began to unravel. He had tried to run, to fight, to make sense of it all, but it was useless. The force that had been growing stronger, that had been following him, had already claimed him. The rules of this place, this twisted village, had never been about escape. They had never been about survival. The moment he stepped into the voting station, he had already become a part of it, a cog in the machine that fed on the very will of those who took part. The shadowy figures of the past, those who had vanished without a trace, were not gone. They were here, in the fog, in the whispers, in the very air that now suffocated him. They had all been part of the same cycle, the same ritual. The voting process wasn't a means of choosing a leader, it was a ritual of control, a way to manipulate and consume the souls of the people who participated. Alan had been naive to think he was immune, to think that he could escape. He was just another piece in the grand scheme of things. The world around him seemed to shift and warp, the familiar streets of the village turning into something alien. The buildings stretched impossibly high, their shapes twisting like gnarled branches. His vision blurred, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was standing or falling. It was as if the village itself had become part of the nightmare, reshaping itself to accommodate the growing power of the dark force that had overtaken it. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, like something was pulling at his very soul. His body began to tremble uncontrollably, and he fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as if trying to hold his sanity together. But the voice, the force, the power, it was too much. "There is no escape," it boomed again, but this time the words were not just spoken. They were felt. Alan could feel them in his bones, in his heart, in his very essence. It wasn't just a message. It was a command. His will was no longer his own. Tears blurred his vision as he stared at the fog, unable to look away. He could see faint shapes moving within it, figures that were once human, now twisted and formless, their faces a mix of agony and resignation. They were the past victims, the ones who had been swallowed by the same force that now had him in its grasp. They had become part of the cycle, part of the machine that perpetuated the ritual. Alan could feel them, could sense their presence, their silent screams of despair. And then it hit him, the realization that made his stomach drop, that crushed whatever last remnants of hope he had left. He wasn't just trapped. He wasn't just a part of the ritual. He was the next. The voting, the choices, the elections, they weren't about who won. They were about who was chosen. Chosen by this dark force to become part of its endless cycle. Every election was a new harvest, a new set of souls to feed its insatiable hunger. And now, Alan was part of that harvest. His body convulsed as the energy surged through him, his mind fragmented into a million pieces. He couldn't fight it anymore. He couldn't stop it. The ritual was starting again, and this time, he was the one who would disappear. Just like the others. Just like the ones before him. As the darkness closed in, as the fog swallowed him whole, Alan realized, with horrifying clarity, that there was no more Alan. There was only the cycle. The endless, inevitable cycle that would continue to consume, to manipulate, to control. The village, the elections, the votes, they were all part of a grand, unbroken ritual. And now, it was his turn. The end had come. Alan stood by the door of the polling station, nervously surveying the surrounding silence. The elections were over, and everything seemed to have returned to normal, but inside him, there was an overwhelming sense of unease. The note, the unexplained noises, the events of the past hours, all of it weighed heavily on him, like an unseen shadow. He could no longer stay here. I have to leave. I must do this, Alan thought, feeling his heart race. No, he wasn't ready to accept that something supernatural was happening to him, but he could no longer ignore the deep sense of danger. The sound of the door closing behind him seemed to shatter the silence that enveloped everything around him. He stepped outside, taking a few hurried steps forward, and abruptly turned, glancing over his shoulder. Everything looked as it should, the quiet village streets, lit by the soft glow of street lamps, and no hint of danger. Yet, suddenly, the feeling that he was being watched changed everything. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a certainty. His entire body stiffened the moment he felt the cold creeping into his skin. Why couldn't he shake the nagging idea that he would never leave this place? Alan walked faster, trying to cover the distance to the edge of the village, but with each step, the ground felt more slippery, the air thicker. The further he went, the more his feet seemed to sink into the black fog that had begun to rise, slowly enveloping the roads and wooden fences around him. He couldn't stop. This was a matter of life and death. But then, everything changed. A cold wind brushed against his face, and from the darkness ahead, a familiar silhouette emerged. His heart, already pounding, seemed to stop completely as Alan froze, staring at the figure that stood motionless on the road. Do you still think you can escape? The voice was calm, yet devoid of any human warmth. It was the same voice Alan had heard in his dreams, the one that had shattered his sleep with nightmares. Alan didn't answer. He just took a step back, his heart now beating louder in his chest. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt paralyzed. His skin burned with the unbearable sensation of something much larger than he could comprehend happening around him. You can't escape, the figure repeated, and its presence had become not just a part of the night, but its dark essence. Alan couldn't breathe. He started running, not looking back, but with every step, it felt as though his efforts were futile. No matter where he went, the fog would follow him. Still, he tried to break free from this nightmare. But the thought echoed in his mind, if I can't escape, then what remains? Alan had been running for what felt like hours, but the fog around him only grew thicker, closing in like an inescapable web. His heart was racing, his lungs burning, but he couldn't stop. He knew deep down that if he stopped, if he let his guard down for even a moment, it would be the end. And then, just as the darkness threatened to overwhelm him, he stumbled upon something, or rather, someone. Out of the swirling shadows ahead, a figure emerged. At first, Alan thought it was another illusion, but as the figure came into focus, his breath caught in his throat. It was a man, perhaps in his mid-30s, gaunt and pale, with eyes that seemed to be filled with an unspoken terror. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man rasped, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in days. He reached out, grabbing Alan's arm with an unnatural strength that sent a chill through his body. "You can't escape. None of us can." Alan pulled away, confused, but the man's grip remained firm. "What? Who are you?" he managed to gasp, his mind reeling. This man didn't seem like someone who could help him. He was another victim, just like the others. "They will never let you leave." "It's too late for us," the man said, his eyes haunted by something terrible, something that Alan couldn't even begin to understand. "What do you mean?" Alan asked, fear creeping into his voice. "Who are they?" "The ritual. The elections. They are just a cover. A way to control us. To steal our souls," the man whispered, his face twisted with the torment of his own understanding. "I tried to warn the others. They didn't listen. They all disappeared, one by one. They're part of it now, too." Alan felt a coldness wash over him, like an invisible weight pressing down on his chest. The words rang in his ears, but they made no sense. Souls stolen? Rituals? Control? Was this real? Or had his mind finally fractured under the pressure of what he'd seen and heard? The man's expression softened, but there was no hope in it, only resignation. "You're part of it now, too. You don't even know how deep you're in." Alan stumbled backward, trying to process the man's words, but he couldn't focus. His mind raced with the images of the voting booths, the people he'd seen in the past, and the strange feeling that had taken over his every move. Could it be true? Had he unknowingly entered into something far more sinister than an ordinary election? Suddenly, the man reached out again, his eyes wild with fear. "They're coming. You need to leave. You can still try to escape. Please. Before it's too late." Before Alan could respond, the man's body began to tremble violently. His hands gripped his head, and his voice turned into a guttural scream. "It's too late for me," he cried, as his form began to distort, his body shaking as if it were being torn apart by an unseen force. Alan stepped back, horrified, as the man's figure collapsed into the fog, vanishing before his eyes. It was as if the darkness had swallowed him whole. What had just happened? Had Alan really just witnessed a man losing himself to whatever dark force controlled this place? And was he now part of it, too? His mind was a blur of fear and confusion, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. But deep down, he knew there was no escape. Not anymore. As Alan turned to flee, a cold whisper slid through the air, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere, yet echoed in his mind, "There's no way out. Only through, and even then, not all of you will make it." Alan gritted his teeth, fighting back panic. He couldn't let it break him, not now. But as he moved deeper into the fog, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something much worse than anything he had yet encountered. Alan's heart pounded as he stumbled deeper into the fog, his every instinct screaming at him to run. But the path ahead seemed endless, a labyrinth of mist and shadows, closing in around him. The chilling realization hit him. He wasn't just running from the dark force that had overtaken this place, he was running from himself. As he moved forward, Alan could feel the presence behind him, a shadow that clung to his every step, pulling him deeper into its grip. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to remind himself that he was still in control, that he could fight back. But the more he tried, the more his mind seemed to slip. He had to stop this. He had to break free. The ritual, the election process, it all had to end before it consumed him completely. Alan's hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled note he had found earlier. "You're not who you say you are." The words seemed to mock him now, a cruel reminder of how far he had fallen into this twisted game. But what did it mean? Who had he become? Was he truly just another pawn in this dark ritual, another cog in the machine that manipulated the votes of the villagers, the souls of the people? A voice echoed through the fog, a voice that wasn't his own. It whispered his name, Alan, but it wasn't a name he recognized. It was something ancient, something that reached deep into his core, stripping away the layers of his identity. "You're already a part of it, Alan," the voice said. "You always were." Alan froze. He felt it then, the cold, creeping sensation of something tugging at his mind, at his very soul. The realization settled over him like a blanket of ice. This wasn't just about votes, about the election. This was about control. And Alan was now its tool. "No," he whispered to himself. "I can fight this. I can stop it." But as the words left his lips, a surge of power hit him. It was overwhelming, like 1,000 voices screaming inside his head. The fog thickened around him, a swirling vortex of darkness, and suddenly he couldn't move. His body felt heavy, as though invisible chains had wrapped themselves around him, pulling him deeper into the heart of the ritual. "No! I won't be a part of this," he screamed, struggling against the invisible force, but his voice was drowned out by the rising cacophony of whispers. The ritual had already begun, and Alan was powerless to stop it. He could feel his thoughts slipping away, his will being stripped piece by piece. His own body betrayed him as his hand reached for the voting box, a compulsion he couldn't control guiding his movements. The box was a symbol, a vessel for the ritual, for the dark power that had controlled the elections for generations. With trembling hands, Alan opened the box, the contents inside glowing with an unnatural light. The pulse of the ritual grew stronger, and in that moment, he knew it was too late. He had become one with the process, a puppet to the forces that had ruled this village for centuries. His breath hitched as his body was forced to place his own vote. He had no choice. He had become the very thing he had feared. His soul was part of the ritual now, and there was no escape. Alan fell to his knees, his hands shaking as the dark force settled over him like a shroud. The last remnants of his will screamed in resistance, but it was no use. The ritual was complete. And Alan, like the others before him, had become one of the many sacrifices to this dark, eternal force. As the fog swallowed him whole, a single thought echoed in his mind: there is no way out. The weight of the dark force pressing on Alan was unbearable. He could feel it now, settling deep within him, wrapping itself around his heart, his thoughts, his very soul. The struggle to break free had turned to despair. Each step forward felt like a desperate attempt to outrun his inevitable fate, but there was no escaping it. The ritual had already claimed him. He sank to his knees, the cold mist swirling around him like a suffocating cloud. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight as though the air itself had turned against him. Alan had spent so many hours trying to understand this force, trying to fight it, but now he saw the truth. It was bigger than him. It was ancient, an insidious power that thrived on control and manipulation. The elections were not just a means to an end, they were a way of binding the souls of everyone involved, like a chain linking them to something far darker. As the realization set in, Alan could feel his mind begin to unravel. He tried to fight it, tried to push against the invisible hands that gripped his thoughts, but every attempt to regain control only made him feel more powerless. It was as though something inside him had snapped, his will weakening with each passing second. A flood of memories rushed to the forefront of his mind. Faces of the missing, the ones who had come before him, the ones who had vanished after the elections. They were all part of this, he now understood. Every member of the commission, every voter, all had been caught in this web. And now, he too was a part of it. The fear crept up on him, not just of the ritual, but of what he was losing. His identity, his sense of self, slipping away. He had been a man, a person with choices, with a life. But now he was just another vessel, another pawn in a much larger game. The realization was suffocating. The fear of losing himself, of losing everything he had been, consumed him. "Why couldn't I see it?" he whispered hoarsely, the sound of his own voice strange in the eerie silence. "Why couldn't I stop it?" But it was too late for regrets. The fear of losing his humanity was more than just a passing thought now, it was a palpable, crushing reality. The ritual had taken him, mind and body. His soul was now part of the darkness that had always haunted this place. His eyes darted around in panic, searching for any escape, any way to break free. But the fog around him only thickened, closing in until the world felt like it was collapsing, folding in on itself. Alan could feel the ritual pulling at him, drawing him deeper into its grip, until he no longer had any sense of time or place. The fear was not just the fear of death. It was the fear of becoming nothing, of losing all that he had been, all that he had hoped to be. He could feel the very essence of who he was slipping away, like sand through his fingers. And as the shadows of the past and future merged around him, Alan came to a terrible, final understanding: there was no way to escape. There was no way to stop the ritual. And there was no way to save himself. He had lost. And with it, he had lost everything. The mist swallowed him whole. The air grew colder, thicker, suffocating. Alan felt his legs weaken as though the ground itself had turned to liquid, pulling him down into the depths of the unknown. The ritual was nearing its climax, and there was no longer any space for resistance. He had tried to run, to fight, to understand, but all those efforts had been in vain. The force had already claimed him, body and soul. As he stumbled forward, his mind flickered through fragmented memories, faces of those who had vanished before him, their eyes empty and lost, trapped in the same fate. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but his voice failed him. The power surrounding him was too strong, too overwhelming. The very air seemed to absorb his words, as though there was no escape from this ancient and malicious force. Alan reached the center of the room, the heart of the ritual. The symbols on the walls, the whispers in the air, the weight of the centuries, all of it now made sense. This was never just about elections. It was about control, about bending the will of the people, consuming their souls one vote at a time. Every vote, every election, was a sacrifice to this dark power. He looked down at his own hands, trembling. The truth burned through him. He had become part of the process, a cog in the machine. There was no way to reverse what had been set in motion. He had become like the others before him, like the missing members of the commission, like the lost souls who had once walked these halls. But before he could take another breath, the world around him seemed to collapse into darkness. It wasn't like any darkness he had known. There were no stars, no moon, no ground beneath his feet. It was as though the entire universe had ceased to exist, and he was left alone in a void. Then, suddenly, he was no longer alone. He could hear them, the voices of the others, the ones who had vanished, their whispers filling his mind. They were all here, trapped in this place, part of the ritual that never truly ended. They were now one with the Force, and he was about to join them. His heart raced. The sensation of being pulled into something larger, something beyond his comprehension, was overpowering. He felt his body give way, his essence, his soul, being torn from his physical form. The last shred of his humanity screamed out for release, but it was useless. The ritual had completed. In one final, terrifying moment, Alan vanished, just as the others had before him. There was no scream, no warning, just an overwhelming darkness swallowing him whole. And just as quickly as it had all begun, the ritual was complete. The village returned to its usual quiet, as though nothing had happened. The voting booth was empty, the ballots sealed. Another election had passed, and everything seemed as if it were just another ordinary day. But the truth remained, buried deep beneath the surface. Alan was gone, and the dark power behind the elections would rise again. The cycle would continue, and the trap would be set for the next soul. The darkness, as always, would wait. Alan tried to run, his every muscle screaming in protest as he pushed himself further from the center of the ritual. His breath came in ragged gasps, but with every step, the pull grew stronger, a force beyond his control. He could feel it deep in his bones. This was not a normal place. This was not a normal time. It was as though the very fabric of reality itself was beginning to tear, and he was being dragged along with it. There was no escaping it. He stumbled forward, his vision blurring. The path that had once seemed so familiar was now twisted, distorted. He couldn't recognize anything. The trees, the buildings, even the sky, all of it shifted, twisted into something unrecognizable. Alan knew the truth now. It wasn't just the village, it wasn't just the dials of the election system, it was the very air, the ground, everything. They had all become part of the ritual, part of the cycle that fed the unseen power. A whisper echoed through the darkness, one voice at first, then another, and soon it was a chorus, a sea of voices calling out to him. They spoke in tones so soft and alien, but filled with such urgency that Alan couldn't help but listen. It was the voices of the lost. The ones who had disappeared before him, now forever trapped in this nightmare, speaking from beyond the veil of reality. "Come back," they whispered. "You can't escape. It's already begun." Alan wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But it was as if the very ground beneath him refused to let him leave. His legs felt like lead, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, he was pulled back, inch by inch, as if something invisible was slowly reeling him in. Each step forward felt like a betrayal, a mistake. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as though they were beckoning him to join them. And he knew they were right. No matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he tried to escape, there was no distance that could save him. Alan was already part of the ritual. His soul, his very essence, was already entwined with this dark process. The election was never about the votes, it was always about the ones who would become sacrifices. The world around him shimmered, bending, folding into impossible shapes. Alan felt his grip on reality slipping. Was he still in the village? Was he still on Earth? Or had he crossed into something far more sinister, far more ancient? He didn't know anymore. He reached out, his hand trembling, trying to touch something, anything that would ground him in this place. But his fingers passed through the air like it was smoke. He wasn't there anymore. He couldn't feel the solid earth beneath him. He couldn't feel the wind on his skin. All he felt was an overwhelming sense of disconnection, a slow, creeping sensation that he was becoming less and less a part of the world he had known. The voices were everywhere now, too many to count, too many to ignore. They didn't just speak, they consumed. "Help us," they whispered. "You are one of us now." Alan tried to hold onto his thoughts, tried to scream, to fight back against the pull, but with every moment it became harder to remember what was real. His surroundings blurred even more, shapes twisted and distorted like melting wax, the ground beneath him softening into nothingness. He was losing himself, losing his sense of place. With one final, desperate attempt, Alan took a step back, hoping for escape. But it was futile. He could feel his body no longer responding to his commands. It was as though he had crossed a line, one that could not be uncrossed. The voices, now deafening, surrounded him completely, and in one final instant, Alan vanished, his presence wiped from the world like a forgotten dream. The darkness swallowed him whole, and the ritual continued, as it always had, as it always would. Alan awoke to an eerie stillness. The familiar hum of the village was gone, replaced by a chilling silence that swallowed everything. His eyes flickered open, but the world around him felt foreign, distorted. The room he was in, once so ordinary, a simple election office, now seemed like a place lost to time, untouched by the outside world. He was back at the polling station, but it was no longer the place he had known. The walls were darker, the air thicker. There were no sounds, no voices, only an unsettling quiet that pressed in on him from all sides. It was as if the very space had become a void, a liminal place between worlds where the normal rules no longer applied. Alan stood up, his legs shaking as if he had just woken from a deep, unnatural slumber. The floor beneath him felt softer, as though it had lost its solidity. Every step he took felt like it was taking him deeper into the unknown, like the ground itself was swallowing him. Panic surged through him. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. He reached out for something to hold onto, anything to ground him. But there was nothing. His hand passed through empty air, the feeling of weightlessness growing stronger with each passing second. And then he felt it. A pull, subtle at first, but undeniable. It wasn't just the atmosphere, no, it was something else. Something invisible, intangible, but powerful. His body began to move, almost without his consent, drawn towards the far corner of the room. His legs carried him forward as though they were no longer under his control. He tried to resist. He planted his feet firmly, gritting his teeth and willing his body to stop. But the force was too strong. Every attempt to break free made it worse, as if the very air itself was pushing him in the direction it wanted him to go. His heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Fear gripped him, not just the mental fear of what he was experiencing, but a physical sensation, as if his very body was being torn from his own will. His skin felt hot and clammy, his breath shallow and erratic. The space around him seemed to close in, walls shrinking, the room becoming smaller, more suffocating. He turned, trying to get a glimpse of the doorway, of the exit, anything that could offer him an escape. But there was nothing. The walls of the polling station seemed to be shifting, bending, warping. The windows were covered in dark shadows, and the door was nowhere to be seen. This place, whatever it was now, did not follow the laws of reality. It existed in a different state, one that denied him freedom. The more he fought, the stronger the pull became, as if something deep within the building was controlling him, guiding him, forcing him to obey. Alan stumbled forward, his feet moving of their own accord, and he felt the very essence of the place wrapping around him, pulling him into its depths. He was becoming part of it, part of the ritual, part of the process he had tried to escape. Every step he took felt like a surrender. He wasn't in control anymore. This place had claimed him. And with that realization, a bone-deep fear gripped him, the kind of fear that comes when you understand that you are no longer in the world you knew. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Alan couldn't breathe. His chest tightened, his vision blurred, and the weight of the room seemed to bear down on him. He was no longer a participant in an election. He was no longer just a man. He had become something else, something part of the very fabric of this place, a cog in the machine that fed on fear, on power, on the souls of those who fell prey to it. And still, the pull was there. Irresistible. As he stepped forward once again, his footfall sounded like a drumbeat in the silence. Each movement felt like it was dragging him deeper, further into the heart of the mystery, the dark heart of the ritual. In that moment, Alan understood he wasn't just caught in this place. He was becoming it. And there was no escape. As Alan stumbled deeper into the darkened polling station, the weight of the silence around him pressed heavier than before. His body, moving against his will, felt like it was slowly becoming detached from his mind. The physical sensations, the chill of the room, the oppressive air, started to blur with something much more unsettling, the growing awareness that there was something beyond just a haunting presence at work. He had tried to fight it, tried to maintain control over his thoughts, but now the truth began to unfold before him like a slow and dreadful revelation. Alan no longer felt like just a man caught in a mysterious trap. His mind, once clinging to the illusion of autonomy, now started to grasp a far darker reality. This was not just about him. His struggle was not merely a battle of will against an unseen force. It was part of something much larger, something older and more sinister. He was not a victim of circumstance. Alan was a part of the scheme. His mind raced with the realization that he was no longer just observing the events around him, he was intertwined with them. His very existence, his every thought, was being manipulated by this unseen force, which controlled not just the elections but the very fabric of his reality. This was not about a mere election, it was about something far more profound. The ritual, the process, the votes, they were all part of a mechanism that reached beyond this town, beyond the moment, into something that governed everything. It was as though his role had always been written into the script. Alan could feel the weight of the past pressing on him. It wasn't just the previous election cycles that mattered. Every person who had worked here, every soul who had ever stepped onto this land, had been shaped by the same force. The disappearances of the past were not accidents. They were inevitable steps in a much larger, inescapable process. His heart pounded as images flashed before his eyes, memories, or perhaps visions, of those who had come before him. Faces he recognized, but they were no longer the people they once were. They had become part of the machine, just as he was now becoming. Alan could see them in his mind's eye, members of the commission, their faces twisted by the same power that now controlled him. Their eyes were vacant, hollow, as if they had ceased to be human long ago. He saw Emily, a woman who had been part of the commission just a few years ago. In the past, she had been full of life, driven by her ideals. Now, Her face was drained of expression, her body a puppet of the force that governed this place. The same happened to Chris, the clerk who had helped him when he first arrived at the station. He was now a shadow of himself, an empty vessel, his eyes glazed over, staring into the void, as if he had never truly been alive to begin with. Alan understood now. They had all been claimed. One by one, they had become part of the cycle, just as he was now. There was no resistance. There was no escape. This process, the dark ritual, the election, the manipulation, was bigger than any one person. It was something ancient, something that existed outside of time, outside of space. They were all cogs in its wheel, and it was always turning. His body grew colder, and his mind became more distant, like he was sinking into quicksand. The more he fought, the deeper he sank into the inevitability of it all. Every attempt to resist only seemed to draw him further into the web. There was no turning back. The faces of the missing lingered in his mind, and as he walked deeper into the dark heart of the polling station, he knew that he, too, would become just another faded memory. The ritual would claim him as it had claimed them all. The idea of freedom was fading, and he could no longer tell where his mind ended and the ritual began. In his heart, he could feel it, the inevitability. He had crossed a point of no return. The force that controlled this place had claimed him. He was part of it now. And just like the others before him, Alan would disappear. Alan's mind was splintering. Each thought, once sharp and defined, now blurred and fractured. He could feel his sense of self slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The clarity that had once guided him, his ability to question, to resist, to search for meaning, was fading, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating fog. His body, once under his command, now moved of its own accord. He could no longer feel the physical sensations that once anchored him to reality. His limbs seemed to operate without his consent, his feet dragging him further into the shadows of the polling station. Every movement felt distant, as if he were watching himself from outside his own body. Alan could no longer discern who he was or why he was there. His name, his history, his purpose, all seemed to dissolve into the air, leaving behind only a hollow shell. He was no longer certain that he was even Alan anymore. The dark force that had been pulling at him for so long had started to erase his very identity, until he was nothing more than a vessel for its will. Time, too, had lost all meaning. It was no longer something he could measure or track. Moments bled into each other, and he felt as though he had been trapped in this place for an eternity, or perhaps only for an instant. He couldn't remember. He couldn't feel time anymore. It was as if the seconds themselves had dissolved into the same void that was consuming him. The space around him began to warp and stretch. The walls of the polling station seemed to close in on him, then pull back, as if the very structure of the room was shifting, distorting, becoming something unrecognizable. The shadows twisted, and every corner of the room seemed to stretch out beyond the limits of reality. Nothing felt solid. Nothing felt real. Alan tried to focus, to hold on to something, anything, that would ground him, but it was futile. The force, the ritual, had completely overtaken him. His mind was no longer his own, his thoughts were no longer his own. He felt himself becoming part of the very darkness that had consumed the others before him. The desire to resist, to fight, was slipping away, because the more he struggled, the deeper he was pulled into the void. He could feel his consciousness splintering, like pieces of himself being chipped away. His memories, once so clear, now felt distant, fading as though they belonged to someone else. His name was no longer a connection to his identity, it was just a sound, a whisper in the dark. The concept of who he was, what he had been, became irrelevant in this place. Alan understood now. He was not just in a physical space, but a spiritual one, a place where the boundaries of his very being were being erased. He could feel himself being absorbed, becoming part of the machine, a cog in the eternal ritual that controlled this town, this process, this world. He was no longer a person. He was part of the ritual. And as his sense of self faded, Alan finally understood he could never return to reality. He was lost, swallowed by the dark, unending force. His identity, his mind, his very soul had been consumed. There would be no going back. Alan's existence came to a complete end. The last traces of his consciousness dissolved, absorbed into the insatiable, all-encompassing darkness of the ritual. His soul, once vibrant and full of thoughts and desires, was now part of something far larger, far more sinister, a never-ending cycle of control and manipulation. As his final thoughts flickered in the void, Alan felt a strange, hollow connection to the countless others who had come before him. He wasn't alone. No, he was part of something far greater, a collective, an entity that stretched across time and space, feeding on the lives of those it trapped. The others who had disappeared, those whose names were lost, whose memories had vanished, were now bound to this force, just like him. They were all now one with the ritual. Their wills, their very souls, were under the control of this dark presence. And in that moment of realization, Alan understood the true horror of it all. The process had no end. The election cycle, the manipulation, the ritual, it was eternal. The victims, those who vanished, were merely replacements for the next set of souls who would be consumed. The same shadows that had taken him would one day take others, and the endless loop would continue without mercy. Alan had become part of the system, a cog in the machinery of control. The cycle never broke, it never stopped. The elections would go on, the dark power would grow stronger, and the names of those who disappeared would fade into the abyss, lost to history. The pattern would repeat, endlessly, feeding the unseen force. The final image of Alan was not one of terror or resistance, but of resignation. He no longer fought, no longer struggled. His soul was no longer his own, it was part of a greater entity, a being that controlled every aspect of this twisted ritual. The choice, the will, the hope for freedom, these were illusions, long forgotten in the face of the dark, eternal process. And as Alan faded completely from existence, the cycle began anew. The election continued. New participants arrived. And the ritual, ever hungry, would consume them all. There would be no end. No escape. The fate of all who entered this place was sealed. The windmill in the field. My name is Henry, and I've lived on this farm in Nebraska for almost 30 years now. It's quiet out here, usually peaceful, with miles of open field stretching as far as the eye can see. Life on the farm isn't easy, but I've never needed much more than the steady rhythm of days, tending to the animals, fixing the fences, and watching over my land. In the middle of all this land stands an old windmill, a relic from my father's time and his father before him. It's always been here, a silent and steadfast watchman, rusting and weather-beaten, but still towering proudly in the field. I've seen it every day of my life, a familiar sight against the endless sky. But lately, it hasn't felt quite as reassuring. It started a few days ago. I was out early, just before dawn, checking on the animals, when I looked over at the windmill. There wasn't a hint of breeze that morning, not even the faintest whisper of air stirring, yet there it was, one of the blades moving, ever so slowly, almost like it was testing itself. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, seeing things, or that maybe a stray gust had caught it. But then it happened again. The blades would shift, just barely, at times when there was no reason for it. It didn't seem like much, and yet it left a strange feeling in my gut, a little twist of anxiety I couldn't shake. There's something unsettling about seeing something you've always trusted, something as solid and familiar as an old windmill, do something that doesn't make sense. It's as if it's trying to tell me something, or as if something else is trying to get my attention. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it. Something was wrong. I tried to brush it off. Windmills are old machines, after all, and this one had been standing out in the elements for decades. Maybe a loose bolt or rusted gears were causing the blades to move on their own. Metal can shift as it cools in the early morning air, or maybe the weight of the blades had finally gotten to the old beast. All simple, rational reasons. Nothing strange. Nothing supernatural. That's what I told myself, at least. I'd laugh it off, tell myself I was being foolish, and get back to my work. The animals needed feeding, the fences needed mending, and there were always chores waiting for me. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that feeling wouldn't go away. A dull, persistent unease settled in my chest. Every time I looked back toward the windmill, I found myself holding my breath, half expecting to see those blades creaking along again without a hint of wind. I'd even feel a chill run down my spine if I caught myself looking for too long. I was letting my imagination get the best of me, that's all. It's easy to feel a little on edge when you live out here by yourself, miles away from the nearest neighbor. You start to hear things, see things that are really there. It's probably just loneliness, I thought, that in the isolation getting to my head. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, that nagging feeling stayed, lurking in the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. By late afternoon, I had nearly managed to forget about the whole thing. After all, there were fences to mend, a broken water trough to fix, and endless bales of hay to stack. Hard work has a way of keeping your mind off things. But as I made my way back to the house, my eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the windmill. It stood there, casting a long shadow over the field as the sun sank lower. Something about it seemed different now. Maybe it was just the fading light, but the metal looked darker, heavier, as if the old windmill was carrying something it hadn't before. That was when I heard it, a faint sound, like the scraping of metal against metal, drifting through the still evening air. It was too soft for the wind to carry, yet somehow, I could hear it clearly from where I stood. I paused, trying to place the noise. It was almost like the sound of a blade sliding against its own housing, but slower, more deliberate, like a creak that had come alive and grown a mind of its own. I stayed rooted in place, listening, trying to rationalize it. Old machinery makes sounds, I reminded myself. But this was different. The noise didn't seem random, it had a rhythm, a pulse, something unnatural about it. For a moment, I could have sworn it was calling to me. And that chill I'd felt earlier? It came back, prickling along my skin as if the very air around me had turned colder. That night, I lay in bed, trying to shake off the day's strange events. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, still silence that settles over the fields after sundown. Normally, I found peace in that quiet, but tonight, the silence felt tense, almost waiting. I turned over, closed my eyes, and tried to let sleep take me. But just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, the faint, eerie creak of metal. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. The sound was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the windmill. The noise was so soft, like a whisper carried on a breeze that wasn't there. I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up higher, but each time I was about to drift off, I'd hear it again, a slow, rhythmic scrape, a sound that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat through the night air. I lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, a stray breeze setting the blades in motion. But the feeling in my gut told me that wasn't it. The noise seemed to have a strange life of its own, all that defied explanation. And there, in the dead of night, listening to that faint, ghostly creak echoing across the fields, I felt truly alone, and for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own land. When morning finally came, I felt as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed, and a heavy exhaustion pressed down on me, clouding my thoughts. The events of the night lingered like a bad dream, yet I knew all too well that it had been real. Each time I glanced out the window and caught sight of the windmill standing tall in the distance, an uneasy shiver crawled up my spine. I couldn't let it go on like this. I told myself that I just needed to inspect the windmill, look over the gears, and check for loose parts. A rational explanation would settle my mind, and I'd finally be able to put this ridiculous fear to rest. With a deep breath, I set out across the field. But as I got closer, that strange, creeping dread began to tighten around my chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if an invisible weight was bearing down on me. My heart pounded harder with every inch closer, and an irrational urge to turn back gnawed at me. Standing only a few feet from the windmill now, I could feel the overwhelming sense of wrongness radiating from it. I tried to reason with myself. This was just an old machine, nothing more. But that logic was swallowed by the disquiet thrumming through me. The metal seemed colder than it should be, even in the morning sun, and I swore I could hear the faintest echo of that same slow, scraping sound from the night before. For a brief moment, I nearly turned back, ready to abandon the whole thing. But my pride, and my need for answers, held me there, forcing me to reach out toward the rusted metal, even as every instinct told me to walk away. As I closed the last few steps between me and the windmill, I noticed something odd, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The blades looked different. They weren't in their usual position. They should have been angled in the same direction, like spokes on a wheel, but now they seemed slightly off, almost twisted, as if they'd shifted ever so subtly overnight. I blinked, thinking it must have been a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games on me. But as I looked closer, the metal itself seemed to have taken on a strange quality. The way it caught the sunlight wasn't normal. It shimmered in a way that felt unnatural, casting faint, distorted reflections that danced over the field like moving shadows. I found myself squinting, trying to see clearly, but each angle only revealed more unsettling details. The blades didn't look like they were rusted in places anymore. Instead, they seemed to almost absorb the light, as if drawing it into the cold metal rather than simply reflecting it. The effect left the air feeling heavier, darker, as though the space around the windmill had its own aura, a strange, looming presence that chilled me to the bone. Standing there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the windmill wasn't just an old piece of machinery anymore. It felt almost aware. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I took in the subtle yet impossible changes. This was no longer the familiar landmark of my childhood. It had become something other, something that defied reason. And deep down, I knew that whatever was wrong with the windmill wasn't just a trick of the eye. It was something far worse. I took a cautious step forward, reaching out to inspect the base of the windmill, hoping to find some rational explanation for these unsettling changes. My fingers brushed against the metal, and immediately, I felt a strange sensation, a faint, buzzing current that pulsed under my touch, like an electric charge running just beneath the surface. I yanked my hand back, startled. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There shouldn't have been any electricity flowing through the windmill. It wasn't connected to anything but the wind and its own rusty gears. I'd grown up around this machine, fixed it, painted it as a boy, and in all that time, I never felt anything like this. Tentatively, I reached out again, pressing my hand against the cold metal. The charge was still there, a soft, persistent hum that seemed to resonate through my fingertips, tingling up my arm. It was faint but unmistakable, as if the windmill had somehow come alive with a low, humming energy. The sensation made me feel uneasy, like touching something forbidden or sacred, and a strange thought flickered in my mind. It was absurd, but it almost felt like the windmill was aware of me, like it was reacting to my touch. The feeling unsettled me deeply, stirring up a fear that I couldn't rationalize away. I stood there, hand hovering just an inch above the metal, my heart pounding. The windmill was no longer just a relic on my land, it was something I didn't understand, something that had crossed a line into the unexplainable. I took a step back, my mind struggling to process what I had just felt. The strange electric charge still tingled faintly in my fingertips, and it left me feeling uneasy, like I had brushed against something that shouldn't be disturbed. I glanced up at the windmill, half expecting it to stay as still and lifeless as it always had. But that's when I noticed something else, something that sent a chill straight through me. One of the blades was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it began to turn, inching its way around the metal frame until it faced directly toward me. My breath caught, and for a moment, all I could do was stare, rooted to the spot. There wasn't a single gust of wind, not even a hint of movement in the air. And yet, the blade shifted, aligning itself as if it had a mind of its own. A sick, twisting sensation welled up in my stomach. It felt wrong, deeply, profoundly wrong. The way the blade angled toward me, it almost seemed like it was watching me. I know how absurd that sounds, but there was something in the way it stood, frozen and looming, that made me feel exposed, like I was under some cold, mechanical gaze. I took another step back, and I could have sworn the blade seemed to lean toward me ever so slightly, as if acknowledging my retreat. The air around me grew heavier, pressing down, thick with a sense of something unnatural, something that didn't belong on this land. A part of me wanted to run, to turn my back and put as much distance as I could between myself and this strange, silent watcher. But I felt trapped, my feet planted to the ground by a mixture of fear and disbelief. That evening, as the shadows stretched long across the field, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. Something about the windmill, about the strange occurrences, seemed to have an explanation just out of reach, yet the more I thought about it, the less logical it seemed. I tried to distract myself by going through the usual chores, but my mind kept drifting back to that feeling of being watched, of something ancient and dangerous awakening beneath the layers of time. The electric hum, the way the blades moved despite the stillness of the air. It wasn't natural. I knew it. I sat down at the kitchen table that night, staring out the window at the windmill in the distance. The same strange shimmer I had seen earlier was still there, catching the last rays of the setting sun in an eerie glow. My hands trembled slightly as I absent-mindedly fiddled with an old map of the farm that I had kept in a drawer for years. That was when a thought occurred to me, a memory, one I hadn't thought about in ages. My grandfather used to tell me stories when I was a boy. Stories about the land, about old places that held secrets, about things that shouldn't be disturbed. He would speak of forgotten spirits, of forces that could settle into the earth, in old homes, or even old machines. He He told me that when a place had been left alone for too long, it could sometimes attract the wrong kind of energy, something dark and ancient that could latch onto forgotten objects. I laughed those stories off back then, dismissing them as the ramblings of an old man. But now, in the dim light of my kitchen, I couldn't ignore the similarities. The windmill had stood there for decades, untouched, forgotten by time. What if some forgotten energy, had been awakened by the windmill's age? Or worse, what if the windmill itself had become a vessel for something malevolent? I felt a creeping chill run through me, colder than anything I had felt before. Maybe it was just the old man's tales playing tricks on my mind, but something told me I wasn't looking at a simple windmill anymore. There was something else, something darker, hiding in its rusted metal and creaking blades. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the thought. Whatever force was at work here was ancient, and it was only just beginning to reveal itself. That night, sleep was out of the question. I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled deep in my bones. Whatever was happening with the windmill, it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The idea of turning my back on it, of pretending everything was fine, felt like surrendering to something I didn't understand. And something in me told me that if I didn't confront it now, I might never get the chance. I took a long, slow breath and moved to the window, staring out into the moonlit field. The windmill stood there, unchanged to the eye, but I knew better than to trust my eyes alone. Something was wrong. I could feel it, like the air itself had become thicker, heavier around the old structure. The metal shimmered faintly in the dark, reflecting the light in a way that was wrong. Too bright, too unnatural. I told myself I would keep watch for the night. I needed to understand what was happening. If I stayed in the dark, I risked not knowing until it was too late. It might seem foolish, staying here like some superstitious fool, staring at an old windmill in the dead of night, but the other option was to walk away, and I couldn't do that anymore. I positioned myself by the window, the dim glow of the moon casting long shadows across the floor, and watched. The windmill loomed in the distance, still, silent. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just the same old structure standing sentinel over the field. But I knew better than to think that nothing was happening. I had already felt its presence, felt its strange, unexplainable energy. Time passed slowly, as if the very air had stopped moving. The night was heavy with silence, and I could hear every creak of the house as the wind shifted outside. Every so often, I would glance at the windmill, checking to make sure it hadn't moved again. It hadn't, not yet. But I knew it was only a matter of time. Hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, my eyes growing heavy from the strain of staying alert. But I couldn't afford to close them, not yet. Just when I thought I might be imagining things, I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible shift. One of the blades moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it were stretching awake after a long sleep. My pulse quickened, and my heart raced. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the weather. There was something else at work here, something I hadn't fully understood yet. The windmill was alive, and it was waiting. I pressed my hands to the windowsill, leaning forward, watching it move, waiting for the next sign, the next clue. I was going to stay vigilant. I had to. Because whatever was happening, whatever was awakening out there, I wasn't going to let it take me by surprise. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and growing terror. Each morning, I woke with the same gnawing dread in my stomach, knowing the windmill was out there, waiting. I tried to convince myself that I was simply imagining things, that the strange occurrences were just a result of stress, or maybe too many sleepless nights. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. It started small, at first, just the odd shifting of a blade when the air was still, as if the windmill had a mind of its own. But now, it was more than that. I began to notice something even stranger, something I couldn't explain away with logic or tiredness. Every time I looked at the windmill, the blades seemed to move in my direction. Not just a simple turn, but a deliberate, conscious shift. They would angle themselves, slowly, with an almost eerie precision, as if they were aware of my gaze. If I turned away, distracted by something else, I could feel the windmill's presence looming behind me, watching, waiting. And when I looked back, sure enough, the blades would be facing me once more. It wasn't just that the blades moved, it was the way they moved, as if they were responding to me, as if they knew I was there. Each time I caught sight of them, the blades seemed to shift, almost like they were following me, tracking my every move. It was as if the windmill was aware of me, and the realization sent a cold shiver down my spine. I stood in the doorway of the barn, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, trying to shake off the sensation that I was being hunted by something I couldn't see. But every time I glanced out the window, the blades were positioned toward me, waiting. I stepped outside cautiously, heart pounding in my chest, trying to keep my focus on the horizon, not daring to look directly at the windmill. But I couldn't help it. My gaze drifted back to the field, and I froze. The blades had turned, yet again, and now they were facing me squarely. As if they had seen me, as if they were ready. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that this wasn't just the windmill turning in response to the breeze, it was following me. Every time I looked away, it would wait. And then, as soon as my attention was on it again, the blades would shift to face me, unblinking, unyielding. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The windmill wasn't just an inanimate object anymore, it was something more. Something sentient, something alive. I could no longer deny it. The fear gnawing at my insides was real. The windmill was aware. And it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make the next move. The feeling was inescapable. Whatever force had awakened inside it wasn't going to stop. It was only just beginning. The weight of the situation pressed on me more heavily with each passing day. The windmill's strange behavior was no longer something I could ignore. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. So, I decided to speak with the neighbors, people who had lived in this area far longer than I had, people who might know something about the land, its history, or perhaps even some old tale about the windmill. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I had to try. The closest farm was just a few miles down the road. I drove there late one morning, trying to push the unease gnawing in my stomach to the back of my mind. It had been a while since I'd seen old Tom and Mary, and even longer since we had chatted about anything other than the weather or crop yields. I pulled up to their modest farmhouse and stepped out, shielding my eyes against the sun. Tom was out front, hammering nails into a fence post, and Mary was tending to the vegetable garden. They both looked up as I approached, their faces warm with familiarity, but there was something in their eyes that made me pause. "Morning, Tom." "Mary," I greeted them, trying to sound casual. "Hope all's well." Tom wiped his brow with the back of his hand and gave me a slow smile. "Morning, neighbor." "Everything's good here, same as always." "What brings you out this way?" I hesitated, but the weight of my worry pushed me forward. "I've been having some strange things happening out by my place, near the old windmill. I don't know if it's just me, but, well, I thought I'd ask if you've noticed anything odd lately. Maybe with the weather, or the land itself." Tom and Mary exchanged a quick glance. It was subtle, but I saw it, like a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. who I was talking about. Funny you mention that, Mary said, her voice soft, but there was an edge to it. We've noticed something too. The weather's been different this past week. More than just the usual change in season, there's been this strange, biting chill that lingers in the air, especially around the windmill. It's not the wind, it's something colder. Hard to describe. Tom nodded. You're not the only one who's felt it. Every time I pass by that field, it's like a weight presses down on me. Not just cold either, there's a stillness to it, like the air's holding its breath. And I swear, I've seen things shift in that windmill. Blades turning even when there's no breeze. It ain't right. The words hung between us like a fog. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't crazy. They had felt it too. The same cold. The same unease. Tom and Mary had been noticing the changes in the weather, the shift in the air, and the strange way the windmill seemed to move by itself. I was not alone in this. I tried to steady my breath, but the fear that had been building inside me began to rise again. Do you think it could be something to do with the windmill? Or something else? Mary gave me a long look, as if weighing how much to say. You know, my grandmother used to tell me stories about places like that, places where strange things happen. She said that some places, especially old machines like that windmill, could hold on to things. Dark things. Things that don't go away when they're left alone for too long. Tom cleared his throat, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss the thought. Old stories, you know? Nothing more than that. But I can't deny what's been happening lately. I don't think it's just bad weather or coincidence. I nodded, trying to ignore the cold creeping down my spine. I was no longer sure what to believe. But one thing was certain, whatever was happening, whatever was causing the chill and the strange movement of the windmill, it wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and it was spreading. Something was awake, and it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known in a way we couldn't ignore. That evening, after my unsettling conversation with Tom and Mary, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air. The weight of their words lingered in my mind like a dark cloud, growing thicker with each passing minute. I had to find out more. The stories they mentioned, the cold, the strange movement of the windmill, it was all too much to dismiss as coincidence. It felt too real. I went back to the house and, instead of going to bed like I should have, I sat down in my study, lit a lamp, and began to scour old books. My father had been a collector of history, folklore, and anything that seemed to tell a tale of the land we lived on. I started digging through the shelves, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. The words blurred before my eyes, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it all. I flipped through books on local history, farming, and weather patterns. But nothing seemed to answer the growing anxiety gnawing at me. That's when I stumbled across an old, worn leather-bound book. It wasn't one I recognized. The title was barely legible, The Haunting of Forgotten Places, Spirits, Machines, and the Supernatural Forces of the Plains. Curiosity piqued, I opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the words were still clear enough. As I read, a chill crawled up my spine, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. The stories in the book described haunted places, forgotten machinery, and the spirits that could inhabit them. There were tales of windmills like mine, machines left abandoned or neglected for years, eventually becoming vessels for restless souls. According to the author, these spirits could find refuge in mechanical objects, especially if they had been idle for a long time. The energy, the motion, the cold, it was all part of the process, a subtle call to these lost spirits. I couldn't help but recall the strange feeling I had around the windmill. The sense that it was alive, that it was aware of my presence. Could this be what I was dealing with? A spirit that had somehow found its way into the old windmill? The thought seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more it felt like the only explanation that made sense. The book went on to describe how, over time, these spirits could grow stronger, especially if they were fed by the fear of the living. The more fear the inhabitants of the land felt, the more the spirit would thrive. The cold, the eerie silence, the way the windmill seemed to watch me, it all fit. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the book in my hands. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I thought about the stories my grandmother used to tell me as a child, tales of spirits who would take over machines, finding their way into abandoned homes and barns, seeking shelter in any forgotten corner of the world. Could one of these spirits have taken refuge in my windmill? I couldn't dismiss it. The strange cold, the way the windmill reacted to my movements, the growing unease that now surrounded the place. It wasn't just the weather. It wasn't just an old machine. There was something more, something far darker, at play. I felt a strange mix of dread and fascination. Was the windmill simply a vessel for a restless spirit, or was something else at work here? Something more malevolent? The stories seemed to hint at something darker, an energy that could take root in the land itself, turning the very earth and objects around it into conduits for forces beyond our understanding. I put the book down for a moment and glanced out the window. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the field. The windmill stood there, motionless for the moment. But I knew it wouldn't stay still for long. I could feel the pull of it, like a presence in the night, waiting, watching. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I truly understood. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep pretending this wasn't real. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just a strange phenomenon. It was something much deeper, much older, and it was only a matter of time before it made its intentions clear. I wasn't sure if I could fight it, or even if I should. But I knew one thing, it was far from over. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images from the book haunted me, gnawing at my thoughts like rats in the dark. The more I tried to convince myself it was just superstition, the more I found myself drawn back to the windmill. It felt as though something was calling me, something beyond my understanding, something ancient. After hours of restless pacing, I decided to take a walk to clear my head, to at least try to shake the tension that gripped my chest. I left the house around midnight, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The air was thick with silence, the kind of deep stillness that blankets the world when everything is waiting for something to happen. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but there was a subtle pressure in the air, as if something was building. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and my heart began to pound as I made my way across the field toward the windmill. As I neared the windmill, I saw it. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. The blades of the windmill were turning, fast, faster than I had ever seen them move. But the air was as still as ever. There wasn't the faintest breeze to explain the rapid motion. It was as though the windmill had come to life, moving with a force that defied nature itself. I stopped dead in my tracks. The windmill was spinning faster and faster, the metallic creak of the blades cutting through the night like a saw tearing through wood. It was louder now, unnaturally loud, and the sound echoed across the field, bouncing off the silent, empty landscape. The whirring was almost deafening, a terrible, rhythmic noise that sent a sharp pang of panic through my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off it, my heart racing in my throat. Each rotation seemed to pick up speed, spinning uncontrollably. My feet felt frozen in place, as if the windmill's motion was pulling me in, forcing me to watch. The once steady, deliberate movement of the blades now felt like something violent, something driven by an unseen force. And still, the air remained motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I took a cautious step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The closer I got, the more I felt the unnatural pull, like the windmill was drawing energy from the earth itself. The ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with an eerie vibration that made my teeth ache. It felt wrong, like I was no longer in control, like the windmill was feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing second. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around, to flee back to the safety of my home and never look at that damn windmill again. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. It was as if the windmill had me in its grip, like a predator watching its prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the spinning stopped. The blades jerked to a halt, and the world around me fell silent. The oppressive stillness returned. For a brief moment, I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the motionless windmill. It was almost as though it was waiting for something, watching me with a chilling awareness. I forced myself to take a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run, to escape this place before it consumed me entirely. And yet, despite the overwhelming urge to flee, I found myself looking up at the windmill once more, just to make sure it wasn't moving again. But it was still. Dead still. I turned and walked away quickly, my eyes never straying from the windmill as I retreated toward the house. But that nagging feeling lingered in the pit of my stomach, the feeling that whatever had caused the blades to spin so violently, whatever force had taken hold of that ancient machine, wasn't finished yet. It was waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to let me go that easily. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with the events of the evening. The windmill had haunted my thoughts, its relentless spinning and the eerie stillness of the night wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I kept telling myself that it was just some strange anomaly, some freak occurrence that didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just a windmill. Something was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to a crisp, clear day. The sunlight barely broke through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. But as I got dressed and headed downstairs, that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't leave. It gnawed at me, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone, that something was waiting. I went about my day, trying to distract myself with chores, feeding the animals, checking the fences, tending to the garden, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was as if I was being followed, even while I was a good distance from the windmill. I'd glance over my shoulder and there it would be, standing in the distance, tall and still, but somehow aware. I knew it couldn't be just my mind playing tricks on me. The windmill had shifted. It wasn't just standing there anymore, passively part of the landscape. It was alive in ways I couldn't explain. The more I tried to avoid looking at it, the more it seemed to follow me. When I was in the barn, I could sense it, looming out there in the field, watching me from afar. When I worked near the house, I would catch myself glancing out the window, and there it was, its blades barely moving, but still turning in a slow, deliberate arc as though it knew exactly when I looked. Even when I took the long way around to avoid the field, the windmill was always there in my peripheral vision, like it was tracking my every movement. The realization hit me like a cold fist to the chest. The windmill wasn't just responding to my presence. It was following me. It was tracking me even when I wasn't near it. I couldn't escape it. I tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the way the wind picked up at odd angles, or some strange phenomenon in the air that made it seem like the windmill was always watching me. But every time I looked up, every time I glanced toward that field, I could feel it. The way the blades turned just enough to catch my eye, as though it was making sure I was still there, still aware. By the time evening fell, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't do anything except feel the oppressive presence of the windmill hanging over me like a storm cloud. My thoughts raced with panic. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't tell anyone about it. They'd think I was crazy. So, I did what I always did when I was afraid. I worked. I pushed myself harder, trying to drown out the fear with the tasks at hand. I repaired the barn door. I checked the fence again. But no matter what I did, no matter how far I went, the windmill remained in my thoughts. That night, as I lay in bed again, I heard it. The faint sound of the blades turning. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, my breath shallow, my body frozen with fear. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare look. But then, something shifted in the air. The subtle hum of the windmill grew stronger, more pronounced. The vibration under the earth, like a deep, rhythmic pulse, began to rise. It was as though the ground beneath me was alive, echoing the motions of the windmill itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on my clothes and rushed outside, my breath coming in sharp bursts. My heart raced in panic, my feet nearly stumbling as I sprinted toward the field. But when I reached the edge of the property, I stopped dead in my tracks. The windmill stood still. Too still. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. That I had simply let my fear get the better of me. But as I watched, I felt that familiar, unsettling sensation. The windmill wasn't just still, it was waiting. Waiting for me. The blades creaked once, then turned ever so slowly, as if acknowledging my presence. I staggered back, my mind spiraling out of control. I didn't know what to do, where to turn. But one thing was certain, I couldn't outrun it. The windmill, whatever it was, had me in its sights, and no matter how far I went, no matter how hard I tried to escape, it was always going to be there, just beyond the horizon, always watching. And that thought terrified me more than anything. I had reached a point where I could no longer ignore it. The feeling of being watched, the dread that clung to me like a second skin, it was unbearable. The windmill had crossed a line, and every instinct in me screamed that I had to do something. I had to stop it. I had spent days avoiding it, trying to reason with myself that it was just a machine, just an old relic of the past. But now, I knew better. It wasn't a machine anymore. It was something else. Something that wanted me. The thought of walking toward it again, of getting close enough to try and shut it down, filled me with a terror that I couldn't describe. It felt as though every part of my body was screaming to run away, to flee the farm and never look back. But I couldn't. I was trapped. I had to face it. I had to stop it before it consumed me completely. I knew that if I didn't act now, it would only get worse. The windmill had been subtle at first, moving in the background, an oddity I could almost ignore. But now it had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to stop. It was stalking me, hunting me. And if I didn't act, I knew it would only grow stronger, more relentless. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain. I could feel the pressure building, the same unsettling sensation that had been plaguing me for days. Every step I took toward the field felt like I was walking into a trap, a slow march towards something that I knew I couldn't control. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached the windmill, my legs trembling beneath me. The windmill stood there, just as it had every day before. But today, there was something different about it. It felt alive, like it was waiting for me. The blades, once slow and deliberate, seemed to be twitching in anticipation, as though they were aware of my approach. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in me screamed that I was making a mistake. This wasn't just a machine. It was something far worse. I forced myself to keep moving, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I finally reached the base of the windmill, I hesitated. The metal structure loomed above me, casting a long, ominous shadow over the ground. It felt as though it was towering over me, its jagged edges sharp and unforgiving. I could see the gears turning in the machinery, hear the creak of metal against metal, but there was something wrong with the sound. It was too alive. Too real. The windmill wasn't just turning, it was pulsing, vibrating, as though it was reacting to my presence. My breath quickened. I had to do this. I had to shut it down. I reached out a shaking hand to touch the controls, but as soon as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a jolt of electricity shot through me. It was like nothing I had ever felt before. The shock didn't just sting, it sank into my bones, into my very core. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to collapse right there. I pulled my hand back, gasping for breath, but the feeling didn't fade. The pressure, the weight of something pulling at me, pushing at me, only grew stronger. I could feel the windmill's presence in my chest, in my lungs, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. The mechanical hum of the blades was deafening, and yet it wasn't the sound of machinery, it was the sound of something ancient, something far older than I could comprehend. Fear clawed at me, gnawing at my mind. I couldn't stay. I couldn't be near it any longer. And yet, I couldn't move away. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, my body frozen in place by an invisible force. The windmill was waiting for me to make a decision. I tried to push through the fear, to force myself to act, but the closer I got to the controls, the more intense the pull became. It was like a dark hole opening up in my chest, drawing me toward it, urging me to give in. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I was paralyzed, caught in some unseen web of power. I knew then that I wasn't just fighting a machine. I was fighting something that had taken root in this land, something that had awakened in the heart of the windmill, something that wasn't going to let me go without a fight. I had come too far to turn back now. I had to stop it. But the closer I got, the more I realized I might never leave this field alive. The night hung heavily over the farm, a thick fog rolling in from the horizon, swallowing everything in its path. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, its light barely enough to see by. But I didn't need much light to know where I was headed. I knew every inch of this land by heart, and tonight it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Waiting. Watching. I'd spent the whole day steeling myself for what was coming, but now that the hour had arrived, the weight of what I was about to do hit me harder than I could have imagined. Each step toward the windmill felt like I was descending into a darkness I couldn't escape, a void that would swallow me whole. My mind kept screaming at me to turn back, to forget everything I had seen, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. I had to confront it. I wasn't foolish. I knew it wouldn't be as simple as just turning off a switch or pulling a lever. Something was wrong with that windmill, something deeply wrong, and I was certain that the more I pushed, the more it would push back. But I had no other choice. If I didn't act now, I would lose myself to the fear. Or worse, I would lose something far more precious than that. The tools I carried, an old wrench, a hammer, a crowbar, felt heavy in my hands, as though they were laden with more than just their weight. They were the only weapons I had, and I had no idea if they would be enough. I could feel the metal digging into my palms as I gripped them, a reminder of how little I truly knew about what I was dealing with. I paused at the edge of the field, my breath ragged in the cold air, the fog swirling around my feet. The windmill loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the fog. It seemed still, almost peaceful, but I knew better. There was something wrong about it, something that kept pulling me back to it, even though every fiber of my being screamed to stay away. With a deep, shuddering breath, I started walking. My feet moved mechanically, like I was on autopilot. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if the fog itself was pressing down on me, pushing me toward the windmill. I could feel the ground beneath me vibrating, a deep hum that made my teeth ache. Each step I took was met with an overwhelming sense of dread, a constant pressure building inside my chest. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, no, more than watched. Hunted. As I drew nearer, the feeling of the windmill's presence grew stronger. It wasn't just a looming structure. It was as though the windmill itself had become aware of me, had taken on a life of its own. I could feel it watching me, waiting, and I wasn't sure if it was waiting for me to make my move or waiting to consume me. I shook my head, trying to clear the overwhelming fog in my mind, but the weight of my fear was too much. My heart was beating wildly in my chest, and my hands were trembling so badly that I had to grip the tools tighter to keep them from slipping. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn back, to run away before it was too late. But I couldn't. I had to see this through. When I reached the base of the windmill, the world seemed to shrink. The fog, the air, the very ground under my feet, it all seemed to pull me into the center of it, where the windmill's shadow stretched long and dark. I could hear it now, low, guttural creaks from within the machine itself. It sounded like bones grinding together. The rhythmic thump of the blades, turning ever so slowly, but without any sign of wind. It was as if the windmill was breathing, living, waiting for me. A chill ran through me, more than just the cold night air. It was as though something cold and unnatural had seeped into my very bones. The tools in my hands felt almost useless now. What good would they do against something like this? Against something alive? I didn't even know what I was fighting anymore. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I had already come too far. I stepped forward, each movement heavy, slow, as if I was wading through thick mud. The air seemed to press in on me, tighter and tighter. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else, even the creaking of the windmill. I could feel it now, not just with my senses, but with my very soul. It was as if the windmill wasn't just a machine, it was a presence, an ancient force that had been waiting for me, pulling me into its orbit. I took another step, and then another. The fog seemed to thicken around me, closing in like a wall, but I didn't dare stop. The windmill was so close now that I could almost hear the grinding of its gears. Every instinct in me told me to turn around, to flee before it was too late, but I couldn't. I was already in too deep. I raised my wrench to strike the mechanism, one final blow that would end this nightmare. But as my hand lifted, a low, rasping sound echoed in the air, a sound that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't the windmill. It was something else. Something was moving behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, the wrench trembling in my hand. Something was wrong. I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, but there was nothing there. Only the fog, thick and silent, pressing against me like a living thing. But the feeling, that sense of being watched, hunted, was still there, right behind me. And I knew then, it wasn't just the windmill that I was fighting. It was whatever had woken inside it. The moment I raised my hand to strike the wrench against the windmill's base, something shifted. The air around me thickened, charged with a strange, palpable energy. For a split second, I could have sworn I felt the earth beneath my feet tremble. Then, without warning, the blades of the windmill began to spin, fast. At first, it was a slow rotation, barely noticeable, but within seconds, the blades started to accelerate, their metal edges catching the faint moonlight, blurring into silver streaks of motion. A deafening hum filled the air, and the windmill groaned as if awakening from a long slumber. I staggered back, instinctively raising my arms to shield myself from the sudden force of the wind. It came out of nowhere, a violent gust that slapped across my face, cutting through my skin like cold steel. The wind was impossibly strong, pushing against me, dragging at my clothing, forcing me to struggle to stay on my feet. I gritted my teeth, gripping the wrench tighter, but the force of the wind was almost too much. My hair whipped around my face, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift with the turbulence. The blades of the windmill spun faster and faster, slicing through the air like a blade through flesh. The sound was monstrous, a high-pitched whine that rattled my bones. I took a step forward, desperate to close the distance between myself and the windmill. My hands shook uncontrollably. I needed to stop it, needed to disconnect the machine, but the wind was too much, too strong, dragging me back with every step. It was as if the windmill itself had become alive, fighting me, keeping me at bay. I squinted against the wind, trying to focus on the mechanism. The blades whipped past in a blur, the noise growing to an unbearable crescendo. My ears rang, my vision blurred from the cold wind and the terror rushing through me. The wrench slipped from my fingers as the gusts of wind intensified, nearly knocking me off balance. I reached for it, but it was too late. The windmill was no longer just turning, it was alive. I could feel it in every gust, in the way the air pressed against me, pushing me away. Each rotation of the blades was like a strike against my will, each turn of the gear a reminder that I was powerless in the face of whatever force had taken control of the machine. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The windmill didn't slow. It was as if the more I fought it, the faster it spun, the more ferocious the wind became. It felt as though the very air was alive with hate, with some dark, ancient energy that had been awakened in that cursed machine. The ground beneath me shook, and I felt my knees weaken, the wind ripping at me with an unnatural force. The wrench had disappeared into the fog, lost in the madness of the wind. I could no longer hear the mechanical hum, it had been drowned out by the roar of the windmill, now a deafening cacophony of sound. The world seemed to be closing in on me. I turned, desperate to escape, but the wind seemed to follow me, pushing me, forcing me away from the machine, from whatever was controlling it. It felt like the windmill was no longer just a machine, it was something else. Something darker. Something that wanted me. I fought to regain my footing, but every step I took was like wading through an invisible force, pulling me back toward the center of the field, toward the windmill. I could barely make out the silhouette of the windmill against the fog now, but blades still slicing through the night air with increasing speed. I had to get out. With everything I had left, I pushed forward, stumbling toward the edge of the field, my body screaming for air, for escape. The wind was relentless, battering me from all sides, but my eyes were fixed on one thing: the distance. The safety of the house, of something that could protect me from the growing storm behind me. But just as I thought I was free, just as the wind began to ease up, I felt it again, that pull. It was as if the windmill was reaching out for me, dragging me back with a force that I couldn't fight. I broke into a run, my legs weak, but determined. My mind raced with only one thought: get away. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to get, I couldn't escape the feeling that the windmill was chasing me, following me. The wind whistled, sharp and biting, in my ears. The blades blurred in the distance behind me, faster and faster, a growing roar that swallowed everything else. And as I reached the door of the house, I slammed it shut, gasping for breath, my heart threatening to break free from my chest. I leaned against the door, my mind racing, but I knew one thing for sure now. Whatever was in that windmill, it wasn't finished with me yet. The door slammed shut behind me, but the sound of the windmill's frantic, spinning blades didn't stop. It hadn't stopped. The air inside the house felt dense, thick with static, like the atmosphere before a storm. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. But even as I collapsed onto the kitchen floor, shaking, a terrible realization crept over me. The windmill, it wasn't just a machine anymore. It wasn't just a relic of a past era that had somehow gotten caught in a freak gust. It had become something else, something far more dangerous. Something alive, or at least something that was now feeding off of something ancient, something darker than anything I could have imagined. It had turned into a portal. The energy that had begun to pulse through it wasn't natural. The sparks I had felt when touching the metal, it wasn't simple static electricity or rusted components acting up. It was something otherworldly, something that had seeped into the very heart of the windmill, perhaps for decades or even centuries. And now, whatever it was awake. My hands trembled as I clutched the counter, pushing myself to stand. My eyes darted to the window, peering out at the shadow of the windmill on the horizon. The blades were still spinning, still faster, faster than should have been possible. They weren't just turning, they were growing stronger with each passing second, as if something was feeding on the very motion itself, using the windmill as a conduit. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the panic rising in my throat. I could almost feel the windmill's presence, an oppressive weight in the air that pressed down on me. It was as if it had extended beyond the field, reaching into the house itself, pulling at the walls, pulling at me. My thoughts raced. I had seen the signs. The way it had watched me. The way it had followed my every movement. It wasn't just moving because of the wind or mechanical failure, it was moving because it was being controlled. But by what? And why me? I remembered all the things I tried to ignore, the strange sounds in the night, the way the blades would point in my direction, the unnatural hum that seemed to pulse beneath the wind. It was as though the windmill wasn't merely a structure, but a conduit for some other force. An energy that had been trapped in this place, forgotten, maybe even bound here by whatever ritual or accident had brought it into being. I stumbled across the room, my thoughts swirling. The lore, the stories the old farmers used to tell, the ones about things that weren't quite human, about spirits and energies that could be contained or freed. Could this be one of those stories? Had I unwittingly opened the door to something that should have been left alone? Had my attempt to stop it only made things worse? I felt a chill run through me as I realized the terrifying truth. The more I tried to stop the windmill, the more I was feeding it, feeding the energy that had taken root inside it. The energy had taken shape in the machine. It wasn't just trapped in its gears and steel, it had corrupted it, turned it into something unrecognizable. But what if the windmill wasn't just the source of it? What if it was the gateway, the means by which this force could enter our world, could spread beyond the field, beyond the farm? A horrifying thought struck me. Was it already too late? I could feel the pressure building in the air, feel the cold seep through the walls of the house. It was coming, something was coming, and there was no escaping it now. The windmill, once a symbol of my farm's hard work and sustenance, had become something far darker. A beacon. A portal. And now, it was pulling me into its web, whether I liked it or not. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What if I was already too far gone? What if it had already seen me, and now I couldn't escape? The wind was rising again, even inside the house, whispering, almost calling to me. The door creaked, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move outside, a flicker of something large and unnatural against the moonlight. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window, from the thing that had begun to consume my life, my farm, my every waking thought. My body went cold as I realized the truth. I had unleashed something, and now there was no way to stop it. I had awakened it, and it would never let me go. I didn't know what I was doing, but my legs were already in motion, running. My mind screamed at me to get away, to flee this place, but my body seemed to be moving against my will, like it was already under the influence of something else, something beyond me. The windmill, no, that thing, was calling to me. It was like a tether, a chain wrapped around my very soul, pulling me back even as my feet carried me forward, further away from the field. I could feel the pressure in the air around me, the weight of the energy pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It wasn't just the sound of the blades slicing through the air. It was everything. The night felt alive with this force, thick with something unnatural, something that had taken root here and was now trying to spread, to consume. I could almost feel its fingers curling around my mind, twisting it, making me doubt everything I thought I knew about reality. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't turn around, but I knew that the windmill was watching me. The very field felt different, like it was alive, like the grass beneath my feet had grown sentient and was pulling me back. I fought to keep running, but it felt as though the land itself had turned against me, and the harder I ran, the heavier my steps became. Every breath was a struggle. The energy that had been swirling in the air, in the wind, was inside me now. I could feel it in my bones, crawling under my skin, racing through my veins. It was like fire, cold fire that burned from the inside out. It wasn't just the wind or the dark force from the windmill anymore, it was me, too. I could feel it, it had already reached me. I could feel the presence inside me, tugging at my thoughts, pulling my will in ways I couldn't explain. I glanced over my shoulder, despite myself, and the windmill was there, looming in the distance like a dark shadow against the faint glow of the moon. Its blades were still spinning, faster than ever. And I realized then, it wasn't just the windmill I was running from. It wasn't just the machine that had become a portal. I was running from myself. The energy, whatever it was, had already seeped into me, into my mind, into my very soul. The moment I tried to confront it, the moment I tried to stop it, I had let it in. The windmill had marked me, and there was no going back. The pull, the sensation of being followed, it was real. It was here, inside me now, a dark passenger that would never leave. I staggered forward, pushing through the underbrush, but my feet felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. My pulse throbbed in my ears, louder than the windmill's whirring blades, and it was all I could hear. I wanted to scream, to yell for help, but my voice was caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of the energy suffocating me from within. I forced myself to keep moving, but it was becoming harder and harder. My body felt like it was rebelling against me, as though every cell, every muscle, was being pulled back toward the windmill, toward that dark force that had taken hold. The air around me was thick, suffocating, pressing down on me, making every movement feel like it was through water. It's too late, I thought, my mind clouded. I can't escape. It's already here. But I kept running, or at least I tried to. Each step felt like it was dragging me deeper into the grip of the thing that now controlled me, and I realized, no matter how far I ran, no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't escape it. I had already crossed the line, and now there was no turning back. The wind, that cursed wind, howled around me, and the darkness deepened. The land had turned against me, the field stretching endlessly before me, like a maze with no exit, a prison with no door. I could feel the windmill's gaze on me, feel it calling me, and I knew with a sick certainty that I was already lost. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, the cold sweat clinging to my skin. I had no more strength to fight, no more will to resist. The pull of the energy, the force of whatever had awoken inside that windmill, had already claimed me. I closed my eyes, my vision blurred, and I understood the terrible truth. It had always been inevitable. And now, I was its vessel. I could hardly stand anymore. My legs felt like they were made of lead, each step dragging me further down into some invisible abyss. The cold was unbearable, sinking deep into my bones, but it wasn't just the cold, it was something else. Something far worse. I had failed. I had tried to stop the windmill, tried to fight against the unnatural force that had claimed it, but now I could feel it seeping deeper into me. It wasn't just the energy that had twisted the windmill into something monstrous, it had twisted me, too. My thoughts felt fragmented, my body numb, as if the very essence of my being was slipping away, piece by piece. And yet, I couldn't stop. My eyes were drawn back to the field, to that cursed windmill that had become the epicenter of everything that was going wrong. The blades spun in a frenzy now, faster and faster, as though they were hungry, desperate for something they couldn't reach. But it wasn't just the windmill that had changed, it was the entire field. I could see it, even from this distance. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if the soil itself was being warped, bent under some unseen force. The grass, once green and healthy, now looked sickly, twisted in unnatural shapes. The trees surrounding the field seemed to lean away, as though they feared what was happening. But what terrified me most wasn't the way the land itself was shifting, it was the way the energy seemed to be spreading, like an infection, slowly overtaking everything it touched. I had heard old stories of fields that turned wrong, of places where the earth itself seemed to turn against those who dared to tread on it. But I had never imagined it would be like this, never imagined that the very ground beneath my feet could betray me, could betray all of us. The air around me felt thick, heavy with something that wasn't quite wind, something more suffocating, like it was absorbing everything around it, my fear, my exhaustion, my very will to fight. It had already taken root in the land, and now it was spreading, consuming everything in its path. My chest tightened as I realized what I was seeing. The windmill wasn't just a source of the energy, it was the center, the heart of something far larger, far darker. The field, the land, the very air itself had become its vessel, a conduit for whatever force was rising within it. And I was at the center of it. I wanted to run, wanted to get as far away from that place as possible, but I couldn't move. It was as though the field was pulling me in, rooting me to the spot. The cold wind began to howl louder, and in the distance, I could hear a faint hum, like the windmill was calling to me. It wasn't just an inanimate machine anymore. It was alive, aware, and it wanted me. My head spun. The strength was draining from me, as though the energy in the air had begun to leach into my very being. I felt my mind slipping away from me, like I was losing my grip on reality. The cold, the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread, it was all I could feel now. There was no escape. The field, the windmill, the very air around me, all of it had become one with the energy. I could hear it now, clearer than ever, the whispers, the voices, the call. And I realized, with a sinking heart, that there was no running, no place left to hide. The force had already taken hold. It was already too late. I don't know how much time had passed, but the world around me felt wrong. The ground beneath me had lost its warmth, its texture. It was no longer solid earth beneath my boots. It was like walking on a cold, brittle surface, like the very soil had turned to ash, stripped of life. The field around the windmill had transformed, somehow, into something unnatural. The grass no longer swayed with the breeze. It stood stiff, rigid, as if frozen in place, its once greeny now sickly and pale, like something long dead. I tried to move, but each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The windmill loomed ahead, its blades spinning faster than ever, cutting through the air with a relentless screech that filled my ears, vibrating through my very bones. The sound was a distorted, maddening hum now, like the machine itself was alive, feeding, growing. And it wasn't just the land that had changed. The air, too, felt wrong. It was thick, almost suffocating, swirling with a heaviness I couldn't explain. It tasted metallic on my tongue, biting and sharp, like I was inhaling something foreign, something that shouldn't exist. Every breath I took was laborious, as if the very atmosphere was pushing against me. My chest tightened with each inhale, the pressure building in my lungs as if I was suffocating on some unseen force. I could feel my pulse in my throat, loud and rapid, the blood rushing to my ears. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort, something deeper, darker, was affecting me. It started as a cold, crawling sensation under my skin. At first, I thought it was the chill of the night, but soon it became something more. It was as though the very energy in the air was touching me, seeping into my body, infiltrating every nerve. My fingers began to tingle, then my arms, my legs. It was a strange, numbing sensation, as if I was losing control of my own body, as though the energy was slowly draining my strength. The world around me seemed to be fading, losing its color, its vibrancy. The once familiar landscape, the fields, the distant hills, the farmhouse, was now shrouded in a sickly, unnatural pallor, as though life had been sucked out of everything it touched. The trees, their branches bent and twisted in impossible shapes, seemed frozen, as if they, too, were under the influence of whatever dark force was taking hold. And it wasn't just the land, it was me. I could feel it within me, the pull of the energy that had seeped into my very soul. My thoughts were becoming clouded, disconnected, as if something else was trying to take over. The cold, the darkness, the weight of the air, it was all closing in on me, consuming my mind, and I couldn't fight it. It felt like a weight on my chest, pressing me down with unbearable force, suffocating me in ways I couldn't explain. I couldn't think clearly. My breath was coming faster, shallow and erratic, and my vision began to blur. It was as though I was no longer seeing the world with my own eyes. No, it was something else, something alien, something that wasn't supposed to be here. My hands trembled as I tried to steady myself, but it was futile. The energy, whatever it was consuming me from the inside out. In that moment, I realized with growing horror that I wasn't just witnessing this change, I was becoming part of it. The force had reached into me, had touched me, and now there was no going back. The world around me was dying, but so was I, in a way that was even more terrifying. The energy, the windmill, it was transforming me, bending me to its will. I looked toward the windmill, its blades spinning faster and faster, and I felt something shift in the pit of my stomach. It was like the earth was no longer mine. The land, the windmill, the very air, it was all part of something much bigger, something I had no understanding of, no power to fight. The energy wasn't just here anymore. It had found its home in me. I stumbled back toward the house, my body moving as if on its own, each step heavier than the last. The ground underfoot felt distant, disconnected, as though I were walking through a fog, and the very air around me seemed to press in tighter with every passing second. I couldn't shake the sensation that I no longer belonged here, that somehow my body was no longer mine. It was as if I had become a stranger in my own skin. My movements were stiff, jerky, like I was operating from a distance, watching myself through someone else's eyes. My hands, pale and trembling, felt foreign. The way my feet dragged through the dirt, the weight of my limbs, it was all so wrong. My chest was heavy with an unfamiliar pressure, and every breath I took was forced, shallow, as if the air itself didn't want me to breathe it in. I wanted to scream, to shout at myself to wake up, but I couldn't find the words. The strange energy from the field had followed me, woven itself into the very fabric of my being, and now it was infecting everything I did, everything I felt. As I neared the house, the familiar silhouette of the barn and the weathered porch should have been a comfort, but instead, it felt like a strange, oppressive weight was pressing down on me. The door creaked as I pushed it open, but the sound echoed unnaturally through the stillness, too loud, too sharp. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a coldness that shouldn't have been there, like the warmth had been drained from the walls themselves. The house, my sanctuary for so many years, now felt empty, alien, as though I no longer belonged. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. My eyes scanned the room, the familiar old furniture, the worn carpet, the pictures on the walls, but it all seemed so distant, so unreal. Each object felt like it had been placed in a dream, far out of reach. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface of the table, but the wood felt strange, slick, almost oily, as though it were no longer just wood. My mind seemed to skip over details, as if my memories were turning to dust, crumbling away with every passing moment. Faces in the photographs blurred as I stared at them, as if they were becoming less and less real. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt truly present. Was it yesterday? A week ago? The days were all beginning to blur, fading into nothingness, leaving me grasping for something to hold on to. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. The silence of the house was broken by an unsettling sound, the faintest rustle, as though something was moving just out of sight. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, the house settling, the creak of old wood. But then came another sound, a low, drawn-out whisper, like something, or someone, was standing just behind me, breathing in my ear. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. The door was shut tight, the windows sealed. There was no one here. Yet, the sound lingered. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house, it was inside me. A voice, soft and indistinct, slithering through my thoughts, tugging at the edges of my consciousness. I tried to shake it off, but the whispers only grew louder. It was as if the house itself was speaking, the walls breathing, the shadows in the corners moving. I turned quickly, unable to look anywhere without feeling eyes on me, watching me, waiting. I couldn't tell where the sounds were coming from, couldn't tell if they were inside my mind or all around me. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered out before I could touch it. Darkness enveloped me, thick and suffocating, and for a moment, I wondered if I had truly entered my own house, or if I had somehow wandered into a place that was no longer mine. Something had changed, something I couldn't see, couldn't name, but I could feel it. In every creak of the floorboards, in every breath I took. I was no longer alone here. I wasn't alone anywhere. And that voice, it would not stop. No matter where I went, it was always there. The V. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the mind, a lingering echo of the terror I'd felt while I last stood before it. But now, it was everywhere. I couldn't escape it. I'd glance out the window, and there it would be, looming in the distance, its rusted frame cutting through the horizon like a jagged scar on the landscape. Even when I shut my eyes, I could still see it, feel its presence, as if it were watching me. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an after effect of the fear. My mind playing tricks on me, amplifying my anxiety. But it didn't make sense. The V should have been miles away by now, hidden behind the curve of the fields or swallowed up by the evening mist. Yet, somehow, it was always there. Always visible, no matter where I was, no matter where I looked. And then came the dreams. Every night, without fail, I would close my eyes and fall into a deep, restless sleep, only to be greeted by the same nightmare. The V, spinning endlessly, its blades slicing through the air with unnatural speed, the sound of metal grinding against metal filling my ears. But there was something more. In the dreams, the blades were not just turning, they were reaching, stretching out toward me, clawing their way toward my very soul. I could hear the whispers again, that same voice, only now it was louder, clearer, and filled with malice. In one dream, I tried to run, but no matter how fast I moved, the V remained just a few steps behind, its blades spinning faster and faster, creating a wind so strong that it felt like the very air was trying to tear me apart. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, breath coming in short gasps, but the feeling would linger, that suffocating presence. I could still hear the blades in my ears, feel the wind on my skin, even as I lay in my bed. It was as if the V had become a part of me, bound to my very essence, a force I couldn't outrun. And during the day, it was no better. I'd be working in the fields or walking around the house, trying to focus on something, anything, that would distract me from the oppressive feeling that hung over me. But then I'd glance toward the horizon, and there it would be, always there, always watching. The V never let me forget it. It never let me escape. I tried to keep busy. I tried to act normal. But with every passing day, the V grew stronger, and so did the voice. The whispers followed me wherever I went. I couldn't tell if they were real or just in my head anymore. They sounded so close, as if they were coming from inside my skull, slipping through the cracks in my thoughts. It wasn't just a presence, it was an infection, crawling through my veins, spreading to every part of me. And the worst part? It was like the V knew me. Knew my every move, my every thought. I could feel it reacting to me, just as I had feared. It wasn't just a machine. It was something more. It was alive, alive with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't stop it. And I was starting to wonder if it ever let me go. In the dead of night, I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that the next time I opened my eyes, the V would be waiting, always there, always just on the edge of my vision, always reminding me that I was not alone and never would be again. I had no idea how long I had been standing there, staring at the spot where the V should have been, knowing full well that it would be there, that it would always be there. My mind was fractured, scattered like a broken mirror, every shard reflecting a different piece of me, none of them whole. I couldn't remember the last time I had slept more than a few hours, or the last time I eaten with any true hunger. Time felt meaningless, as if it had stopped altogether, frozen in a moment of endless, suffocating dread. It was then that I understood, with a clarity that struck me like a hammer to the skull. The V was not just out there. It had never been just out there. It was inside me, too, woven into the very fabric of my being. I felt it in my bones, pulsing beneath my skin, like an invasive sickness slowly consuming me from the inside out. The whispers had stopped being whispers. They were now a constant hum, a low, buzzing sound that rattled in my mind every second, every waking moment. My thoughts, once my own, now felt alien, as though they were being twisted by invisible hands, reshaped by some force far beyond my understanding. I turned around slowly, the weight of the air pressing down on me as if the land itself had become a part of the mechanism, pulling me into its orbit. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and yet I couldn't stop myself from moving forward, couldn't stop myself from walking toward the one thing I knew would always be waiting. It was almost like the V called to me, like I was drawn to it, bound by an unseen tether that grew tighter with every step. I could feel its presence in my chest, deep within my ribs, a cold, pulsing energy that vibrated through my very core. The wind, always still, seemed to swirl around me now, an invisible current that followed my every movement as if it was following me. I reached the door to my house, but the threshold no longer felt like a sanctuary. The walls that had once been my refuge now seemed to close in on me, pressing me down, suffocating me with their familiarity. The V was here, in every corner, in every shadow. I could feel it beneath the floorboards, behind the windows, in the cracks of the walls. It was everywhere. And then, as I stood there in the doorway, the final truth broke through my fractured mind like a floodgate, and I understood with terrifying clarity I wasn't going to survive this. Not in any way that mattered. I wasn't running from it anymore. I wasn't even fighting it. I was part of it. The V, that ancient, twisted machine, had become something else, something far worse than I could ever have imagined. It was alive, and it had infected me. Its energy, its presence, its hunger, it was in me now, growing, feeding, changing me. My mind, my very soul, had been altered, reshaped by it. And in this twisted dance, there was no escape. The whispers, no, the screams ripped through me, louder now, deafening, as if the very walls of my mind were breaking apart. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the earth itself groaning under the weight of the power that had taken root here. The V had not just been a machine. It had been a door, a portal for something ancient, something dark and hungry. And now that it had me, it was never going to let me go. I stumbled backwards into the house, but the house wasn't my home anymore. The walls pressed in on me, the floorboards creaked with the sound of something scratching beneath them. The shadows danced with twisted forms, shapes that weren't quite real, but they were here, and they were mine now. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I would never be free of it. The V had become a part of me, and I a part of it. I was no longer a man. I was its. And it was in me. Forever. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.